We're going to look at the history, and we're going to track the economic signals that tell the real story.
All right, let's just jump right in. Is 2025 the year we finally see another stimulus check? Maybe for $2,000, maybe even more? I mean, let's be real, people are struggling. It's been a tough few years, and a lot of folks are looking for any kind of break they can get. So what's really going on? Are we going to see another big round of payments hit our bank accounts next year?
You know, the funny thing is, the answer to that question has nothing to do with petitions or online chatter. Lawmakers don't just act because we ask them to. The real trigger, the thing that actually makes a stimulus payment happen, is 100% tied to the health of the U.S. economy. And once you grasp that connection, honestly, the whole picture gets a lot clearer.
So let's break this down. There's a fundamental principle at play here, a kind of simple rule that dictates when the government decides to step in with this kind of major financial help. And it's actually a pretty predictable mechanism. That is, if you know what you're looking for.
I want you to picture a seesaw at a playground. On one side, you've got the strength of the economy. On the other side, you have the likelihood of a stimulus check. Now, when the economy is strong, it's booming, unemployment is low, companies are hiring, that side of the seesaw is planted firmly on the ground. The chance of stimulus? Very, very low. But what happens when the economy gets weak? When it starts contracting, unemployment starts ticking up, and you hear whispers of a recession? Well, that side of the seesaw goes way up in the air, which brings the stimulus side crashing down, making it way more likely.
This brings us to a concept called inverse correlation. Now, I know that sounds a little jargony, but the idea is super simple. When one thing goes up, the other goes down. They're opposites. A stimulus payment isn't a reward for a good economy. It's a rescue tool for a weak one. The government uses it when they think the economy is about to fall into a recession and it needs a jolt to get people spending again. This is probably the single most important thing to understand in all of this.
And look, this isn't just some theory. It is a clear, undeniable pattern that we have seen repeat itself every single time our economy has faced a major crisis, for more than 2 decades now. History really gives us a crystal clear roadmap here.
Just think back over the last 3 major recessions. In 2001, the dot-com bubble burst. And what happened? Stimulus checks were issued. Fast forward to 2008, the housing market completely collapses, and it takes the entire economy down with it. The government's response? You guessed it, stimulus checks. And then, of course, in 2020, the pandemic shuts down the entire world, triggering a massive recession. And what did they do? Once again, stimulus checks. It's the same play every single time.
Let's look at the actual numbers. Back in 2001, after that tech bubble popped, the government sent out checks for $300. Now, at the time, that was seen as a pretty big deal to try and stabilize things.
Then we jumped to the massive financial crisis of 2008. The economic damage was just immense. So the government responded again, but this time the checks were for $600. Keep that number in your head. It doubled from the last recession.
And that brings us to 2020. The economy basically slammed on the brakes overnight. It was completely unprecedented. So lawmakers passed the CARES Act, and that very first stimulus check, it was for $1,200. Do you see it? That number doubled again from the 2008 amount.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. Because when you put these numbers side by side, it's not just random. A very clear and kind of curious trend emerges. It's a distinct pattern of escalation.
I mean, the math here is it's incredibly straightforward. From $300 in 2001, it doubled to $600 in 2008. Then from $600, it doubled again to $1,200 in 2020. Every single time a major recession hits, that initial relief payment has doubled. That can't be a coincidence, right?
So naturally, this makes you ask the question, if this historical trend were to continue, what would the math suggest is next? Well, if you double $1,200, you get $2,400. Now, let me be perfectly clear. This is not a prediction. It's not a promise. It's simply an observation based on a very clear historical pattern. But it is a pretty interesting thought, isn't it?
Okay, so this all brings us to the most important question of all. If a weak economy is the trigger, what are the specific red flags we should be watching for right now as we head into 2025? Think of this as your personal toolkit for seeing what's coming down the tracks.
All right, these are the headlines you need to pay attention to. First, rising unemployment claims. This is the big one. It's a direct signal that businesses are hurting and jobs are being lost. Second, keep an eye on the Federal Reserve. When the Fed starts cutting interest rates like they began to do in September of 2024, it's their way of saying, uh-oh, things are slowing down too much. They're trying to give the economy a shot of adrenaline. And finally, just listen to the language on the financial news. When you hear words like softening, slowing, or contracting over and over again, those aren't just buzzwords. That's the consensus that the seesaw is starting to tilt.
And you have to remember, while the economic slowdown can feel kind of gradual, the actual shift into a full-blown crisis and the government's response can happen in the blink of an eye. Seriously. Just think back to early 2020. In February, most of us were living our lives completely normally. By March, everything was shut down. And by early April, stimulus checks were already starting to hit people's accounts. It can go from 0 to 100 in just a matter of weeks. It happens that fast.
So, the real takeaway here is this. Your best forecast isn't going to come from listening to politicians' promises or signing online petitions. It's going to come from you paying attention to those key economic signs we just talked about. The economy tells the real story, long before any official announcement is ever made. The data, that's the real crystal ball.
So, as we wrap this all up, the picture becomes pretty clear, right? We have the seesaw rule. A weak economy triggers stimulus. We have the historical precedent. It has happened in every single major recession for the last 25 years. And we have that wild doubling effect in the amounts. History has basically drawn us a map, and it leaves us with one final provocative thought. The pattern seems to be set in stone. The only real question left isn't if it will repeat, but when. There's some major buzz around a proposal that could put an extra $1,400 directly into the pockets of millions of people on Social Security. In this explainer, we're going to break down exactly what this proposed payment is all about, where the idea even came from, how it might actually work, and what it really signals about the future of retirement benefits in America. Okay, let's get right to the heart of it. A really prominent advocacy group is asking a powerful question. Should Social Security beneficiaries get a special, one-time payment of $1,400? I mean, it's a pretty bold idea, and believe me, it's starting to gain some serious traction.
$1,400. That's the number right at the center of this whole conversation, and it's coming from the Senior Citizens League. They're calling it a catch-up payment. It's designed to fix a financial shortfall they say has been building up for years. Now, to really understand why, we first need to talk about this growing gap in the system.
To get why there's such a big push for this payment, you've got to understand the problem it's trying to solve. And that's something called the cost of living gap. Put simply, it's this disconnect between the official annual increase that people get in their benefits and the real-world costs they're facing every single day.
You see, every year, Social Security benefits get adjusted. It's called the cost of living adjustment, or COLA for short. The whole point of the COLA is to make sure your benefits purchasing power doesn't shrink when the price of everything else goes up. In theory, it's supposed to keep things balanced. But as you'll see, a lot of people are arguing the theory just isn't matching reality anymore.
Now look, any increase is helpful, of course, but advocacy groups are really sounding the alarm here. They're arguing a figure like this just isn't cutting it. It's not enough to cover the true financial pressures that seniors are dealing with, especially when it comes to the absolute essentials.
And this quote right here from the Senior Citizens League really gets to the core of it. They talk about a sharp erosion in purchasing power. What does that mean in plain English? It means that even with those yearly adjustments, the actual value of a Social Security check is shrinking. The money just doesn't go as far as it used to. And the reason for this? Well, it comes down to how the COLA is calculated.
So here's the technical part, but it's really important. The current COLA is based on something called the CPIW. That's an index that tracks the spending habits of urban workers. But advocates are saying, wait a second, retirees have totally different budgets. So they're pushing to switch to the CPIE, which is based on the spending of people 62 and older. And here's the crucial part. The CPIE gives more weight to costs like healthcare and housing, two of the absolute biggest expenses for seniors. The argument is simple. By using a measurement based on workers, the system is consistently underestimating the real inflation that retirees are facing. And this brings us right back to the solution that's been making all the headlines. To fix this gap between the official COLA and people's real-world costs, the Senior Citizens League has put forward a direct, tangible idea, a one-time catch-up payment.
Okay, let's lay out the specifics. Nice and simple. The who is the Senior Citizens League. The what is a one-time payment of $1,400. And a really key detail here is the for whom. They're suggesting this payment should go to all Social Security beneficiaries. That includes folks getting retirement benefits, supplemental security income, or SSI, and Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI.
And the fundamental why? It's to compensate for all those years where the COLA just didn't fully cover rising costs, essentially giving people a lump sum to help them get back on their feet.
So how would this actually happen? Well, first, it would be a single payment, sent out to everyone who's eligible. Second, and this is really important, it's designed as a bonus. It would be in addition to the regular annual COLA, not a replacement for it. And finally, there's a precedent for this kind of thing. The government already has ways to do this, modeled on relief efforts from the past, like the economic recovery payments back in 2009, or even the recent stimulus checks. So the infrastructure to make it happen is already there.
Now, while that $1,400 catch-up payment is getting a ton of attention, it's really important to note that it's not the only idea being floated to boost benefits. There are other proposals out there that take a very different approach to solving the exact same problem.
An alternative, and you could argue more structural idea, is a permanent, ongoing, monthly increase to benefits. This isn't about a one-time fix, it's about fundamentally raising the baseline of what people receive every single month, year after year. This approach is famously part of a piece of legislation called the Social Security Expansion Act.
So let's actually compare the financial impact here. The catch-up proposal, that's a one-time boost of $1,400. A huge help for immediate needs, for sure. The Social Security Expansion Act, on the other hand, proposes a $200 increase every single month. Over a full year, that adds up to a $2,400 increase in benefits. So you see, it's less money right up front, but it provides a sustained, predictable income boost month after month. They're just two very different strategies aiming for the same goal.
So whether we're talking about a one-time payment or a permanent monthly raise, both of these proposals really stem from the same conclusion. The current system just isn't working the way it was intended to. And that brings us to the much larger debate about the future of the cost of living adjustment itself, and really the financial security of millions and millions of Americans.
Let's just recap the core arguments for why a change is needed. First, the COLA calculation is flawed. It just doesn't reflect what seniors are actually spending their money on. Because of that, their buying power has been seriously eroded for decades. And the stakes here are incredibly high. For almost 40% of beneficiaries, Social Security is their only income. And what's the result of all this? An estimated 7.3 million seniors are living on less than $1,000 a month. These aren't just numbers on a page. For so many people, this is a genuine financial crisis.
And all of this leaves us with the ultimate question. It's not really about if costs are rising. We all know they are. The real debate is how our most important social safety net should adapt to that new reality. Should it be with one-time targeted relief payments, or should it be through a permanent structural change to how benefits are calculated and paid out every single month? That's the conversation that's going to shape the financial future for millions of people.
It's the question that's on pretty much everyone's mind. Are we going to see another stimulus check in 2025? Well, to get to the answer, we're not going to look at the politics of it all. Nope, we're going to look at the data and a really fascinating historical pattern that just might hold the key.
So let's just get right to it. Is 2025 the year we see a fourth stimulus check? Look, the answer isn't a simple yes or no, but the clues, they're kind of hidden in plain sight. You just have to know where to look. And today, that's exactly what we're going to do, uncover them, piece by piece.
And this is the most important part, the thing that a lot of people miss. We tend to think that stimulus checks are just a political football, right? But the data, it tells a totally different story. The decision to send out stimulus has always been tied to just one thing, the health of the U.S. economy.
Okay, so the best way to wrap your head around this is to picture an economic seesaw. It's a really simple but super powerful idea that perfectly explains the relationship between how the country's doing and when the government steps in with financial aid.
So on one side of this seesaw, you've got a strong, booming economy, right? Jobs are everywhere, unemployment is low, things are looking good. When that's happening, there's absolutely no reason for the government to be injecting cash into the system. But when that seesaw tips over to the other side, now the economy is weak. It's softening, maybe even shrinking. Unemployment starts to creep up. And this is the environment where stimulus isn't just possible, it becomes way, way more likely.
This quote really gets to the heart of it, an inverse correlation. All that means is that two things move in opposite directions. Think of it like this. As the economy's health goes down, the probability of a stimulus check goes up. They are perfectly balanced against each other. And honestly, this is the single most important rule for figuring out if any future stimulus is on the table.
And listen, this isn't just some theory we're talking about. It's a pattern, a very clear one that we can trace through every single major recession we've had in recent memory. Each time the U.S. economy has hit a major wall, the government has responded in a surprisingly consistent way.
Let's just run through the history real quick. Back in 2001, the dot-com bubble burst. And what happened? Stimulus. Then in 2008, the housing market completely collapsed, leading to the Great Recession. The response? Stimulus again. And of course, in 2020, a global pandemic basically shut down the entire world. The result was the biggest stimulus package in history. See the pattern? Major economic crisis is always followed by major financial intervention. Every single time.
All right, so let's put some actual numbers on this. After that 2001 recession, the government sent out checks for $300. It was meant to be a shot in the arm for the economy, to get people out there spending again. Now remember that number, $300.
Okay, now fast forward 7 years to the 2008 crisis. The government sends out checks again, but this time they were for $600, exactly double the last amount. Is that just a coincidence? Maybe, but let's see what happened next.
And then came 2020. The economy was in an absolute freefall, and boom, the first round of stimulus checks went out for $1,200. Are you seeing it now? It was $300 in 2001, which doubled to $600 in 2008, which then doubled again to $1,200 in 2020. This isn't just a coincidence, it's a fascinating and frankly undeniable historical trend.
Okay, so that's the history lesson. The pattern seems crystal clear, but what does any of that mean for us, right here, right now? Well, to answer that, we have to look for the exact same warning signs that showed up before those past recessions. Is our economic seesaw starting to tip?
You'll hear economists use this term a lot, economic softening. Sounds kind of gentle, doesn't it? But you should really think of it as the first rumble you feel before the train comes roaring down the tracks. It means the powerful engine of the economy is starting to lose steam. We're not in a full-blown recession yet, but this is that critical phase right before one. And for a while now, we've been seeing the signs.
So, what are these current warning signs? Well, first off, rising unemployment. We're seeing more and more people filing for jobless claims, and that is a classic red flag. Second, the Federal Reserve has started cutting interest rates. They only do that when they see economic weakness on the horizon. And third, borrowing money is just plain expensive right now. These high costs are putting a huge pinch on everyone, from small businesses to families. These three things together are classic signs of economic softening.
And here's something that is so important to remember. This stuff can happen incredibly fast. We like to think we'll see a recession coming from a mile away, but that's not how it works. I mean, think about it. In January of 2020, the economy looked fine. By March, a $2.3 trillion stimulus package was being passed. We went from totally normal to a historic bailout in about 30 days. That's how quickly the seesaw can tip.
So all of this, it brings us to our final point. We've talked about the economic seesaw, we've seen the clear historical pattern, we've looked at the warning signs flashing right now, and when you put all of that together, you get what some people have started calling the 2400 theory.
I mean, just look at it laid out right here. It's so simple. A $300 check after the 2001 recession, then a $600 check after 2008, a perfect double. Then a $1,200 check after 2020, another perfect double. If this three-part pattern holds true just one more time, well, the math is pretty simple, isn't it?
Which leads us to the final provocative question. Does history suggest that the next stimulus check could be for $2,400? Now, let's be very clear, this is not a prediction, it's not a promise. It's just an observation based on a remarkably consistent historical pattern. If the economy does tip into a recession, and if the government responds the same way it has for the last 3 downturns, then doubling the last amount isn't just a wild guess, it's a projection based on the data. The only way we'll know for sure is to keep watching those signs, because as history shows us, time and time again, the economy always tells the real story.
Okay, let's talk about 2 numbers that are, well, everywhere right now. A $200 monthly raise and a $2,000 stimulus check. You've probably heard about them, right? But what's the real story? Today, we're going to cut through all the noise and get you the straight facts on where these ideas actually stand. So, what's really going on here? Are these actual legitimate proposals? Could you potentially get one or maybe even both? Look, with costs going up, it's no surprise that any kind of financial relief is a huge topic of conversation. So let's dive in and separate what's real from what's just wishful thinking. All right, first up, let's tackle that $200 monthly raise. This is the one that's gotten a ton of attention, so we're going to break down exactly where it comes from, what it's supposed to do, and, what's holding it up. So where did this $200 number even come from? Well, it's not just pulled out of thin air. It comes from a real piece of legislation called the Social Security Expansion Act. Now, this bill aims to do a few things, but the part that has everyone talking is a straightforward $200 boost to monthly payments. That's an extra $2,400 a year, which for millions of people would be a massive deal. Okay, this right here is the single most important thing you need to know. As of right now, this is still just a proposal. It has not been passed into law. The Social Security Expansion Act is an idea floating around Congress, but it hasn't crossed the finish line. So just to be super clear, nobody is getting this extra money yet. So why hasn't it passed? Well, it's kind of stuck in a really big debate. The original idea was pretty simple. Give an extra $200 to everybody on Social Security, no matter what their income is. But there's a counter-argument for a more focused approach. What if that money only went to the people who need it the most, like folks living below the federal poverty line? And this quote from our source material really gets to the heart of it. Does every single beneficiary truly need an extra $200 a month? Well, the argument is probably not. The thinking is that if the proposal was narrowed down to focus just on lifting the lowest earners out of poverty, it might have a much better chance of actually getting passed. Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about that second big topic, the idea of a fourth stimulus check. Now, this is a completely different animal. It's not a permanent raise, it's a one-time thing, and the whole conversation around it is driven by a totally different set of circumstances. The number that keeps popping up is $2,000, a one-time payment. Our source material calls it a potential one-off pick-me-up for people who are really struggling. So it's not meant to be some kind of permanent solution. It's more like a direct cash injection to help people get back on their feet when times are tough. So why a one-time check instead of a permanent raise? Well, they're for two totally different things. A raise is about your long-term income. A stimulus check, on the other hand, is like an emergency response. It's a reaction to a bad economy, designed to give people immediate help. That's why its approval is economically predicated, which is just a fancy way of saying it only happens if the economy really starts to struggle. Now, if a stimulus check did get approved, figuring out who gets one would probably look pretty familiar. The biggest hurdle, number one, has always been income. Based on past checks, there'd be a clear income cutoff. If you're below that line, great. Then you move on to other things like having a social security number and not being claimed as someone else's dependent. But yeah, income is always that first big gate you have to pass through. And this, of course, leads to the big question. Let's just say, hypothetically, both of these things got approved. Could a person actually get the $200 monthly raise and the $2,000 stimulus check? The short answer is absolutely yes. You could, hypothetically, get both. Why? Because they're two totally separate programs. They're funded differently, and they're designed to solve different problems. One has nothing to do with the other. And here's the best way to think about it. The $200 raise would become a permanent part of your monthly Social Security benefit. It's a benefit increase. The $2,000 check is a one-and-done stimulus payment for economic relief. They're like apples and oranges. They just don't overlap. But wait, you might be wondering, wouldn't that extra money from the raise push my income too high to qualify for the stimulus? It's a fair question, but for the vast majority of people on a fixed income, the answer is no. An extra $2,400 a year would almost certainly not push you over the kind of income limits we've seen for stimulus checks in the past. Okay, so we've looked at the proposals, the what-ifs, the hypotheticals, but now it's time to come back down to earth. Let's talk about what's actually happening right now. What is the real-world status of these two ideas today? So let's just be perfectly 100% clear. That $200 monthly raise we talked about from the Social Security Expansion Act, it has not passed. It's still just a proposal. And that fourth stimulus check, same story. It has not been approved. Right now, neither of these payments are happening. They are ideas, not laws. No checks are in the mail. But, you know, they face very different challenges to becoming a reality. And this brings us to probably the most important takeaway of all. If you want to know if a stimulus check is on the horizon, don't watch the political news. Watch the economic data. Lawmakers only really consider this kind of thing when the economy takes a serious nosedive, and a lot of people are hurting financially. The real story isn't in the headlines, it's in the economic reports. So in the end, these two different ideas really highlight a bigger question. What's the best way to create financial security? Is it a permanent structural change to benefits, like that $200 raise? Or is it a targeted emergency shot of cash, like a stimulus check, when the economy gets rough? For now, both ideas are on the table, but they're definitely off the books. The only thing we know for sure is that this conversation is far from over. You ever wonder what it would actually take for another stimulus check to be sent out? Well, the answer might surprise you. It's not really about politics, it's all about economic data. So today, let's break down the dominoes that have to fall for that to happen. All right, let's just dive right into the biggest question of all. It seems kind of backward, right? But the answer is, yeah. A weaker economy has always been the single biggest trigger for widespread government stimulus. Let's get into why that is. Okay, first things first. We have to understand why this topic even keeps coming up. I mean, it's not just people being curious. For millions, this question is a direct reflection of their own wallets right now. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? This is the kind of thing you see in comment sections everywhere. When people are really struggling just to cover the basics, that whole conversation about financial relief, well, it gets really loud and it gets really constant. This is probably the most crucial thing to get. Yeah, stimulus checks are passed by politicians, but they're not really a political tool. A better way to think of them is like an economic emergency brake. You only pull that lever when the whole system is slowing down fast and needs a serious jolt to get going again. So that brings us to the trigger itself. What does a weak economy actually look like on paper, in terms of the data? And how do those numbers signal to lawmakers that, hey, maybe it's time to step in? This chart lays it out perfectly. It's like two sides of the same coin. On the left, you've got all the signs of a healthy, humming economy. But on the right, those are the alarm bells. When economists see a big nationwide shift from the left column to the right column, especially that jump in unemployment and a drop in spending, that's the signal. That's when you know the economy's in trouble, and the talk about intervention really starts. This whole cycle of the economy tanking and then lawmakers scrambling to do something, it led a few of them to float a pretty radical idea. What if the help just happened automatically? The idea was called automatic stabilizers, and you can just think of it like a simple if-then command for the economy. If unemployment hits a certain number, then relief payments are automatically sent out. The whole goal was to get money into people's hands way faster by cutting out the slow, messy legislative part. Now, the downside is less oversight, but the focus was on speed. Now, this proposed system gives us a really clear window into how policymakers think about this stuff. And even though this plan never became law, the logic here is absolutely key. It ties stimulus directly to one specific number, the unemployment rate. The plan was super simple. If unemployment hits, say 6%, boom, a payment goes out. If it gets even worse, boom, another one follows. It just shows you how central that single data point is to the whole discussion. Okay, so let's shift gears and look at how this plays out in the real world right now. How does a slowing economy actually turn into money in your bank account? This is the typical chain reaction. And man, it usually happens fast. It all starts with that rapid economic contraction. And in response, lawmakers don't just act, they act big. They scramble to pass these enormous spending bills. Once a bill gets passed, a small slice of that massive pie is carved out and sent directly to us, the consumers. And it's all for one reason: to get people spending again and restart that economic engine. And it's so important to remember this. The checks themselves are almost never a standalone thing. They're usually just one piece of these gigantic, multi-billion, sometimes trillion-dollar packages with these big, sweeping names. The direct payments, they're kind of like the little bone thrown to regular folks inside these much, much larger spending bills. I love this old stock market saying because it perfectly captures why lawmakers have to move so fast. An economy usually grows pretty slowly, methodically, like walking up a flight of stairs. But when it falls fast, like an elevator with the cables cut. It's that sudden, sharp drop that creates the urgency, the political pressure to pass something, anything, quickly. So, here's another way to look at it, and it's a bit more controversial. Some economists actually see recessions as a totally normal, maybe even necessary, part of the business cycle. They call it a big old reset, a chance to clear out the old, inefficient stuff and make way for new growth. From this point of view, stimulus checks aren't really about stopping the reset, but more about cushioning the fall for everybody during that painful, but maybe inevitable transition. Okay, so we've got all these moving parts, all this data, GDP, inflation, consumer sentiment. So if you want to know what the real chances are of another stimulus, it really just comes down to one number. There is one indicator that stands head and shoulders above the rest in predicting what the government will do next. It gives us the clearest, most immediate picture of what's happening to the economy's health right now. And that number is, you guessed it, the unemployment rate. This is the 30,000-foot view. It tells you, in really broad strokes, whether the country is growing or shrinking. So why does this one number matter so much? Well, because a rising unemployment rate kicks off a really nasty, vicious cycle. Businesses start cutting jobs because their revenue is shrinking. But that means people have less money to spend, which, you guessed it, shrinks business revenue even more. It's a downward spiral, and lawmakers try to use stimulus to break that cycle. That's why a consistently rising unemployment rate is, without a doubt, the most important catalyst to watch. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. If a weak economy is what triggers financial help, does that mean we actually have to go through a painful economic reset for widespread relief to even become possible? It's a really complicated question about the tangled relationship between collective hardship and government help. So is a fourth stimulus check coming in 2025? It's a question I see literally every single day, especially from folks on a fixed income, Social Security, SSDI, SSI, VA benefits. In this explainer, we are going to break down the one critical factor that actually decides if another check gets sent out. And I'll tell you right now, it's probably not what you think. Let's get into it. This really is the big one, isn't it? After everything we've been through, the economic craziness, the rising costs, so many of us are hoping for just a little more relief. And look, this isn't just a casual question. For millions of people, it's about financial survival. So we're going to get to the bottom of what it really takes for another check to happen, because the way it works is not what most people believe. And you've got to understand, this financial pressure, it's not just hitting the lowest incomes anymore. The context here is just so important. When people who are earning six figures are struggling more than ever before, well, that tells you there's a major problem in the wider economy. And that is exactly why this question about another stimulus keeps coming up with such urgency, and it's coming from everyone. Okay, so how do we get from all that widespread financial pain to an actual check landing in your bank account? A lot of people, and maybe you're one of them, believe the answer is to just make our voices heard, right? Call up lawmakers, sign petitions. But is that really how this works? And here it is, maybe the single most important thing to understand in all of this. The idea that we can petition our way to a stimulus check. It's a complete myth. According to our source, it has nothing to do with that. The decision is not based on political pressure. It doesn't matter how many voicemails get left or how many emails flood their inboxes. The only trigger is, and always is, 100% based on the economy. All right, so if it's all about the economy, what's the actual purpose of a stimulus payment? Let's be clear, it's not just a handout because the government is feeling generous. It serves a very specific, very technical function in their playbook. And this right here reveals the real intention. Officially, the government doesn't even call them stimulus checks. The technical term is Economic Impact Payment, or EIP. I mean, the name says it all, doesn't it? The whole goal is to have an impact on the entire U.S. economy, not just on our personal finances. So here's how the process actually works. First, and this is the non-negotiable part, the economy has to hit a wall. We're talking a major contraction, a full-blown recession. Only then does the government move to step 2 and send out money. And that leads directly to step 3. They give us that money with one goal in mind, for us to immediately go out and spend it, pumping that cash right back into businesses to stimulate activity and hopefully stop an economic freefall. Now, this might sound a little harsh, but it's the core of the whole strategy. The source puts it very bluntly. The whole point of stimulus is to use us. We, the public, become the tool, the delivery mechanism for the government's economic plan. They're not interested in us saving it or paying off our debt with it. No, they want us to buy stuff, to jumpstart that stalled economic engine. And all of this leads to one critical word, recession. We keep bringing it up because according to the source, a fourth stimulus check is simply not even a possibility without one. So let's look at why this one event is the only catalyst that truly matters. I absolutely love this analogy from the source. Think of the economy like a video game that's gone haywire. What do? You hit the reset button and start over. Well, from an economist's point of view, a recession kind of works the same way. It's painful, for sure, but they see it as a necessary correction that can fix huge underlying problems, like out-of-control inflation. So why is a painful thing like a recession the only real trigger? Well, because a major economic slowdown is the only thing powerful enough to force big systemic changes. When people stop spending, companies are forced to lower prices to get you to buy. That slowdown also forces the Federal Reserve's hand. They have to cut interest rates to try and get things moving again. It is the primary, absolutely non-negotiable condition for stimulus. Here is another fantastic way to think about how the economy moves. You know, investors have this old saying, the markets take the stairs up and the elevator down. What that means is that economic growth is usually slow, steady, step by step. But when a downturn hits, oh, it is not gradual. It's sudden, it's fast, and it's a steep drop, just like an elevator with the cable cut. And we saw this elevator down concept play out perfectly back in 2020. I mean, think back for a second. January 2020, life was pretty normal. By February, things started to feel a little weird. And then just 1 month later, boom, the whole country was in lockdown and stimulus payments were already being sent out. That's how fast the trigger can get pulled when a major catalyst hits. Okay, so that brings us right back to today. We understand the theory. We know the only real trigger is a recession. So what are the signs we should be watching for right now that could tell us that elevator down moment might be coming? And this is where we run into a major conflict. Officially, the Federal Reserve will always project strength. They pretty much have to, right? Because admitting weakness could cause a panic, and that becomes its own problem. But underneath that calm, confident surface, there are a whole bunch of warning signs that things aren't nearly as good as they want us to believe. The source describes it in pretty dramatic terms. The alarm bells are ringing. The red lights are flashing. And for a lot of people, it already feels like we're in a recession. The data is starting to back that feeling up, too. These high interest rates are just crushing spending, and credit card debt is at an all-time high. The whole economy is in a really fragile state where any new unexpected event could be the nudge that sends it down and sends it down super fast. So when you boil it all down, we're left with this one question. Is the economy right now just teetering on the cliff, waiting for that final nudge? Because the possibility of a fourth stimulus check doesn't depend on politicians. It doesn't depend on petitions. It depends entirely on the answer to that question. And that, you can be sure, is something we'll all be watching very, very closely. What if every single person on Social Security, retirees, folks with disabilities, everyone got the exact same monthly check? Not based on what they earned during their career, but on one universal standard. We're going to dive into a pretty radical proposal to set a flat benefit for everyone, right around $2,200 a month. This could totally reshape America's biggest social program as we know it. Okay, so first things first, why are we even talking about an idea this huge? Well, it's because it's trying to solve a really fundamental problem that's kind of baked into the Social Security system right now, a massive and frankly growing divide between the highest and lowest paid beneficiaries. I mean, just look at this. The scale of this gap is pretty staggering. On one end of the spectrum, you have some people getting as little as $50 a month. 50! And on the other end, the maximum benefit is over $5,000. That's not a gap, you know? That's a canyon. And it basically mirrors the same income inequality we see all across the economy. And that massive gap has a very real, very human cost. This number right here, 11 million, that's how many seniors in this country are currently living below the federal poverty line. For so many of them, their Social Security check just isn't enough to feel secure. And this right here is the exact problem a flat benefit is trying to fix. And you know, even if we look at the averages, the picture isn't all that great. The average retirement benefit is just under $2,000, and the average for disability, or SSDI, is even lower, just under $1,600. Now, that might sound okay to some, but when you factor in the crazy inflation we've all been dealing with, the actual buying power of that money is shrinking fast, and it leaves a lot of people on incredibly tight budgets.
So you've got a problem this big. How do you even begin to fix it? Well, the solution being proposed isn't some minor tweak. It's a complete overhaul. The whole idea is to move away from our current earnings-based system to something way simpler and, yeah, a lot more radical.
And here it is, the whole proposal in a single number, a flat, universal monthly benefit of about $2,200 for everyone. It wouldn't matter if you were a CEO or a part-time worker, or whether you're getting retirement or disability benefits. Everyone would get the same foundational payment. For millions of people, that would be an absolutely life-changing increase. So what would this actually do? It would fundamentally change what Social Security is. Right now, it works kind of like an earned pension, right? Your benefit is calculated with this complex formula based on your 35 highest earning years. A flat benefit system just tosses that out the window.
It turns the program into a true social safety net, one that provides a uniform financial floor for absolutely everyone.
The big question, of course, is how in the world could you get from our system today to that one? You can't just flip a switch overnight, that's for sure. The proposal gets that, and it lays out a very gradual, long-term plan for rebalancing the whole thing.
Okay, so this is really the nuts and bolts of the plan. For people at the very top of the benefit scale, those annual cost of living adjustments, the COLAs, they would stop. Instead, their benefit might even be reduced by a tiny percentage each year. And that money would then be used to actively boost the benefits for people at the bottom. The idea is that over, say, 5, 10, maybe even 20 years, the two ends would slowly move toward each other until they meet at that middle point, that equilibrium, like the proposed $2,200.
So where would all that money saved from the high-end benefits go? Well, there are a couple of ideas on the table. One option is to just redirect all of it to boost payments for lower-income folks, which would make that convergence happen faster. Another idea is to split it 50-50. Use half to raise the floor for those who need it most, and put the other half back into the Social Security Trust Fund itself. That could help with those long-term solvency problems we're always hearing about. Now, a change this dramatic isn't just about the numbers on a check. Not at all. It represents a really deep philosophical shift in how we think about the purpose of Social Security. And it actually has a lot in common with another big idea that's been gaining a lot of steam lately. And that idea is Guaranteed Basic Income, or GBI. You've probably heard about the pilot programs popping up all over the place. They're all based on a simple idea. Give a specific group of people a set amount of money every month, no strings attached. A flat Social Security benefit would basically turn the program into the largest GBI in the world, one that's focused on seniors and people with disabilities. And this slide, this really gets to the core of the change. We would be moving from a system that says you get back a benefit related to what you put in, to a system that says as a member of this society, you are guaranteed a basic level of security. It's a fundamental move from rewarding the individual to supporting the collective. So, as you can probably imagine, a proposal this transformative is controversial, to say the least. It kicks up a really fierce and fundamental debate about what's fair, what our responsibilities are to each other, and really the very nature of the social contract. The main argument against it is captured perfectly by this quote. For a lot of higher income folks, Social Security isn't a welfare program. It's a pension they paid into their entire lives. They played by the rules, they paid more in taxes, and they planned their whole retirement around the promise of a higher benefit. To them, cutting that benefit feels like the government breaking a promise. So the whole debate really boils down to this. On one side, you have people saying this is the most powerful tool we could ever imagine to fight poverty among the elderly and disabled. It creates a simple, fair safety net. But on the other side, critics are saying it's just fundamentally unfair to people who paid more in, and it pulls the rug out from under those who plan their lives based on the system we have now. It's a clash of two very, very different visions. And that really leaves us with the ultimate question here. At the end of the day, what is Social Security for? Is its main purpose to reward a lifetime of work based on what you paid in? Or is it to guarantee that no senior or person with a disability has to live in poverty? This proposal really forces us to pick a side, and the answer to that question is going to define the future of retirement for generations. You know, what would it actually take to get another stimulus check? It's a question that's on pretty much everyone's mind. But the answer, and this might surprise you, it has nothing to do with petitions or our personal bank accounts. So in this explainer, we're going to cut right through all that noise and show you the real economic signals, the actual triggers the government officials are watching. So what is the trigger? You know, we keep hearing the economy is strong, but for a lot of us, that just doesn't line up with what we see in our daily lives. So it's totally natural to wonder if more help is on the way. But the answer isn't hiding in our personal finances. Nope. The real trigger is found in the bigger economic picture. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we're going to talk about the real trigger. Then we'll get into how to decode the jobs report and those signals from the Fed. After that, we'll look at the history because there's a clear pattern. And finally, we'll get to the bottom line. Okay, first up, the real trigger. To really get what makes a stimulus check happen, we have to make this really crucial shift in how we look at it. It means we got to stop thinking about our own money for a second and start thinking about the health of the entire U.S. economy. Now, this might sound a little harsh, but stimulus checks are not a response to public demand or because individuals are struggling. They aren't triggered just because we ask for them. The reality is, policymakers, they're not looking at individual bank accounts. They're looking at the entire economic landscape. This slide right here lays out the government's priorities perfectly. On the left, you've got the things that feel so important to us, our bank balances, our bills, right? Well, to them, that's essentially noise. What actually gets them to act are the big picture things on the right, the overall health of the U.S. economy, clear signs of it shrinking, and the risk of a full-blown recession. And, this quote from our source material really says it all. The entire stimulus machine is built around one thing, the economy. The checks get approved when the economy starts to break down or enters a recession. It's not so much a lifeline for us as it is a tool for them to manage the economy. So if it's all about the economy, how do they measure its health? Well, the single most important barometer they have is the monthly jobs report. Let's decode what it tells us, because honestly, it gives the clearest picture of what's really going on out there. Every first Friday of the month, this report is released, and trust me, it is a huge deal. It tells us how many people are working, how many are unemployed, if wages are going up or down, everything. It's considered one of the biggest factors because, well, a country's workforce is the engine of its economy, plain and simple. And this is where we see the real-world impact behind those percentages. When the unemployment rate goes up by just 1%, that sounds small, right? But that single percentage point represents roughly 1.8 million people losing their jobs. A tiny little tick upwards, say 0.1%, means 180,000 people are suddenly out of work. The scale is just massive. And this is exactly why a rising unemployment rate is so dangerous. It kicks off this vicious cycle. It starts slowly. A few people lose their jobs, so they stop spending money. Then the businesses they used to go to see their sales drop. And to survive, those businesses have to cut costs, which usually means, you guessed it, laying off more people. The whole thing starts to snowball, gaining momentum, and it can drag the entire economy down with it. That is the exact scenario that puts stimulus on the table. Okay, next up we have signals from the Fed. Beyond the jobs report, the Federal Reserve sends these little hidden signals about the economy's health. And the biggest clue? Their decisions on interest rates. Which brings us to a key question. We constantly hear that the economy is strong. But if that's actually true, why would the Fed ever cut interest rates? Think about it. High rates are used to cool down a strong economy. So when they start talking about cutting them, what are they really telling us? So here's the hidden signal. When the Fed starts cutting interest rates, especially if they do it aggressively, it's a direct admission that the economy is weaker than the official story suggests. They're trying to get ahead of a problem. By making it cheaper to borrow money, they're hoping to get people and businesses to spend more and prop things up. It's their flare gun in the sky saying, hey, trouble's brewing. Now, this isn't just some theory. This whole response mechanism, a weak economy leading to government action, it's not new. In fact, if we look back over the last, say, quarter century, we can see a very clear and predictable pattern starting to emerge. The historical pattern is it's undeniable. In every major recession over the last 25 years, the government's response has included stimulus checks. In 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, in 2008 during the Great Financial Crisis, and of course, most recently in 2020. Each time the economy took a nosedive, they responded with direct payments. So the takeaway here is that there's a playbook. When the economy contracts in a bad way, the government reaches for the same tool. So anyone who argues they'll never do it again, well, they're ignoring some very clear history. So let's get to the bottom line. We know that stimulus is triggered by a weak economy, not by what's in our bank accounts. But what's the logic here? Why are direct checks the go-to solution? This is the core of it, right here. We, the citizens, are the delivery mechanism. When the economy is spiraling downwards fast, the government needs to pump cash into it immediately to stop the bleeding. And what is the absolute fastest way to do that? Give it directly to millions of people who will then go out and spend it. It's not really a gift to us, it's using us as a tool to get money moving again. And don't think for a second that this would be a slow process. I mean, the government can be notoriously slow, but not with this. They can move with incredible speed. You remember late December 2020? A stimulus bill was signed on a Monday, and direct deposits started hitting bank accounts on Tuesday, the very next day. So, the ultimate takeaway is this. You no longer have to just passively wait for some announcement on the news. Now you know the signs to watch for yourself. A rising unemployment rate and a Federal Reserve that's starting to cut interest rates. When you see those signals, you'll know the economic conditions are aligning for that stimulus playbook to be used once again. Now, you can be the one who sees it coming. Today, we're going to dive into a fascinating new study that completely rethinks those stimulus checks a lot of us received a few years back. It asks a really simple but powerful question. Was there a much smarter way to handle that economic rescue? The answer? Well, it might just change how we think about this stuff forever. Let's get into it. Yeah, you remember it, right? Seeing that direct deposit hit your bank account during what was a really, really uncertain time. For a lot of folks, it was an absolute lifeline. For others, well, maybe it just went straight into savings. This new research suggests that by being a lot more deliberate about who gets the money, we could create a system that's not just more powerful, but a whole lot more efficient too. So to really understand this new proposal, we first have to rewind and look at the old one. Economists have been digging through mountains of data from those 3 big stimulus rounds, and they found some pretty big problems with that money for everyone approach. Let's unpack what they learned. Okay, so the first issue was just the sheer scale of it all. Checks went out to 85% of the entire US population. Think about that. The goal was to get money into the economy fast, no questions asked, but the study argues this was like using a fire hose to water a houseplant. It was just way, way too broad. And of course, that super broad approach came with a truly colossal price tag. We're talking about roughly $850 billion with a B. That's an incredible amount of money. And when you're spending that kind of cash, you really, really want every single dollar to count. According to this research, a lot of those dollars simply didn't. And here's maybe the biggest unintended consequence of them all. All that cash flooding the system at once contributed about 3 percentage points to the inflation that we've all been feeling. You can almost hear the whoops moment in the research. Sending so much money to so many people, a lot of whom didn't need to spend it right away, just helped pour fuel on the fire of rising prices. So the takeaway is pretty clear. It was incredibly expensive, inefficient, and it came with that inflationary sting in the tail. Okay, so if blanketing the entire country with cash isn't the best way to go, what is? Well, the answer lies in a really simple but incredibly powerful economic idea. It all comes down to understanding the fundamental difference between 2 types of people, the spender and the saver. Now, the fancy official term for this is the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC. I know, sounds a little complicated, but it's really not. All it means is this. If I give you an extra dollar, what are you most likely to do with it? Are you going to go out and spend it pretty much immediately? Or are you going to stick it in the bank or maybe pay down some debt? That simple question is the absolute key to unlocking a smarter stimulus. So let's break this down. On one side, you have people with a high MPC. These are typically your low-income folks, people on a fixed income. When they get some extra cash, it immediately gets spent on necessities. We're talking rent, groceries, gas for the car. It gets put right back into the economy. On the other side, you have people with a low MPC. These are usually higher income individuals. When they get an extra check, they're far more likely to save it, invest it, maybe pay off a credit card bill. That money doesn't really move. For a stimulus to actually work, you need spenders, not savers. It's that simple. So how do you take this idea of MPC and turn it into an actual concrete plan? Well, this is where the study gets really exciting. It suggests a completely different strategy. Instead of small checks for everyone, it proposes larger, ongoing checks for a very, very specific group of people. And here it is. The proposal is for ongoing $2,000 monthly checks. But the most important word on this slide is only. These payments would be hyper-focused, going exclusively to those low-income, high-MPC individuals, the people who are guaranteed to put that money right back into circulation. It's like switching from a shotgun to a laser beam.
And the data on this is just crystal clear. The study found that when a high MPC person gets that $2,000, their spending is incredibly fast and predictable. About $1,600, that's 80%, is spent within the first 10 days. The rest of it is gone within a month. This is exactly what you want for economic stimulus. The money doesn't just sit there, it moves, it creates a ripple effect, paying for groceries, car repairs, new shoes for the kids, you name it. You know, it all just comes back to the original goal. The source material puts it perfectly. We're not looking for savers, we're looking for spenders. The entire point is to get money moving, to stimulate the economy. And to do that, you have to give it to the people who are actually going to spend it. It's right there in the name.
So when you put it all together, you take the lessons from the past and you apply this logic of MPC, you end up with a proposal that the study argues is just better from every angle. It's smarter, it's cheaper, and it's way more effective. Let's just recap the huge advantages of this kind of targeted strategy. The advantages are pretty amazing when you lay them out. First, you get a much bigger bang for your buck, a greater stimulative effect because the money is actually spent, not hoarded. Because of that incredible efficiency, the total cost would be significantly less than that $850 billion program from before. But just as important, it sends meaningful, ongoing support directly to the people who are struggling the most, all while avoiding the waste of sending checks to people who just save it. It really is a win from every single angle. And that really leaves us with the big final question, doesn't it? We've seen the flaws of the old model and the compelling logic of this new one. This idea of moving away from these broad, universal payments toward highly focused, targeted financial support, it could be a major turning point in how governments respond to economic crises. It really feels like a blueprint for a future where help isn't just more generous for those who need it most, but a whole lot smarter for the economy as a whole. All right, let's dive into a topic that has so many people talking. We're going to break down this new proposal that could mean an extra $1,400 for Social Security beneficiaries. What is this catch-up payment all about? Let's get into it. So, this is the big question, right? Could a check for $1,400 actually be on the way? You've probably seen the headlines, and it's really easy to get confused. So what we're going to do is cut through all the noise and figure out, what's fact, what's just talk, where this idea is coming from, and what it could actually mean for the millions of people who depend on Social Security. And here it is. This is the number at the very heart of this whole conversation, $1,400. Now, this isn't just some random number they pulled out of a hat. It's a very specific amount for a one-time payment. And the whole idea behind it is to give a real, tangible boost to people who are feeling the squeeze financially. Okay, so where did this idea even come from? It's really important to note this is not a bill that's been passed into law or anything like that, but it is a formal proposal from a pretty influential group. So let's take a look at who's behind this push and what exactly they're proposing. The group pushing this idea is the Senior Citizens League, or TSCL for short. Now, they're a nonpartisan organization, meaning they're not tied to one political party. Their whole mission is to fight for older Americans, and they've officially put this proposal on the table, calling for that $1,400 payment to go to absolutely everyone who gets a Social Security check. That means folks getting retirement benefits, SSI, and SSDI, the whole shebang. Let's just break down the nuts and bolts here. First, and this is key, it's a one-time payment, not a monthly thing. Second, it's meant for everybody on Social Security. They call it a catch-up payment because the goal is to make up for lost ground. And finally, and this is really important, this would be extra money on top of the regular annual cost of living adjustment, or COLA, that you already get. So that leads us to the real question. Why? Why are they asking for this now? Well, it all boils down to something they call the inflation gap. Think of it like this. Your benefits might go up a little bit each year, but the cost of everything you need to buy is going up way, way faster. There's a gap. And that gap is getting wider and wider, and advocates say the current system just isn't keeping up. This quote from the TSCL really hits the nail on the head. That phrase, erosion in their purchasing power, that's the whole story. It just means that the money you get doesn't buy what it used to. Even with the yearly adjustments, the cost of absolute necessities, we're talking groceries, a roof over your head, and medical bills, is just skyrocketing past what your benefits can cover. And to give you some real-world context, the TSCL is projecting that the COLA for 2026 is going to be about 2.6%. Now, 2.6% sounds okay, maybe, but when you do the math, for the average person on Social Security, that's less than $50 a month. And the people behind this proposal are saying, come on, that is nowhere near enough to close that inflation gap we were just talking about. And this isn't just what one organization thinks. They did a survey, and the results were, well, they were pretty staggering. A full 96% of the people they asked said that the way the COLA is calculated is just wrong. They believe it should be based on different data. I mean, think about that. You can barely get 96% of people to agree on anything. It shows there's a huge belief that the system is broken. So that brings us to the math. How does the government actually figure out the COLA every year? Well, it all comes down to a specific economic measurement, and there's a huge debate raging right now over whether it's the right tool for the job. Okay, quick COLA 101, just so we're all on the same page. COLA stands for Cost of Living Adjustment. In theory, its job is simple, to make sure your benefits keep up with inflation. The idea is that your check should buy you the same amount of stuff this year as it did last year. But the big debate is whether it's actually doing that job anymore. This right here is what the entire argument is about. Right now, the government uses something called the CPIW. It tracks what city workers and clerical staff are spending their money on. But does a 40-year-old office worker spend money the same way a 78-year-old retiree does? Probably not. The CPIW doesn't put a lot of weight on things like healthcare, which, as we all know, is a massive expense for seniors. The proposed fix is to switch to something called the CPIE, which is the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. It specifically tracks what people 62 and older are spending money on, and it gives much more weight to those big-ticket items like housing and medical care. Now, it's really important to see that this $1,400 idea isn't just happening in a vacuum. It's actually part of a much bigger conversation that's been going on for years. There are several different ideas floating around out there, all trying to solve the same problem: how to get more money into the pockets of Social Security beneficiaries. If you just look back over the last few years, you can see a pattern here. Back in 2020, there was a lot of talk about a $200 a month permanent increase. Then, just this year, the Social Security Expansion Act was brought back to Congress. That one includes a $2,400 a year boost. And now we have this new idea from the TSCL for a one-time $1,400 payment. They're all different roads, but they're all trying to get to the same destination. So this chart kind of lays it all out pretty clearly. You've got two main game plans on the table. The TSCL's idea is like a quick injection of cash, that one-time $1,400 payment to help people catch up right now. Then you've got the Expansion Act, which is a more long-term structural change, an extra $200 every single month forever. They both want to help, they just go about it in totally different ways. Okay, we've talked about the what and the why, but now we have to get to the most important part of this whole discussion: reality. Where do these ideas actually stand right now? Because understanding their status is the key to knowing if any of this talk could turn into actual money. Let me be absolutely 100% clear about this. The $1,400 payment and the $200 monthly increase, they are just proposals. They are ideas. They are not laws. They have not been passed by Congress. They have not been signed by the president. There is absolutely no guarantee that either of these will happen. This is the very beginning of a long political conversation, not the end of it. So, if you're going to remember just a few things from our chat today, let it be these. First, an important advocacy group, the TSCL, is fighting for a one-time $1,400 payment. Second, they're doing it because they believe the yearly COLA isn't working, creating that inflation gap. Third, the fix, they say, is to change how the COLA is calculated, switching from the CPIW to the CPIE. And finally, remember, this is just one idea among several designed to boost Social Security. And really, that's where all of this leaves us. We're left with this huge question. Everyone can see that the cost of living is going up, and people on fixed incomes are feeling it the most. The calls for some kind of change are getting louder. So will any of these ideas, the one-time check, the monthly raise, changing the formula, will any of them get enough traction to actually become a reality? That's the question we'll all be watching.
You know, we've all been hearing the chatter about another stimulus check, but today we're going to dig into an argument that says maybe we're all asking the wrong question. What if the next round of aid wasn't for everybody, but was laser-focused on the people who truly needed the most?
I mean, you see it all the time, right? Is another $1,400 check coming? It's the question, and for a lot of people, the hope that just doesn't seem to go away.
But the analysis we're looking at today completely flips that on its head. It stops asking if we should send out more money and starts asking a much sharper question: who should actually be getting it? And you know, that one little change shifts the entire conversation from just a universal handout to a really precise tool for helping people. So let's start with the big idea here. The financial struggle in this country, well, it's not a one-size-fits-all problem, is it? We're not all in the same boat. So why would we all need the exact same lifeline?
And the argument laid out here is super direct. It says, look, sending a check to almost everyone is just not the most efficient way to solve the problem. The real power could come from a targeted rescue mission for those who are really, truly struggling right now.
This whole thing really sets up a clear choice between two very different philosophies. So how does this targeted idea actually stack up against those big, broad stimulus checks we've all seen before? Let's break it down.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the way we've done things before.
Broad, universal checks that went out to something like 85% of the entire population. And yeah, that came with a really high price tag, but on the other side, you have this proposed approach. It's focused, it's targeted, it goes only to low and fixed income folks, which means the cost is much, much lower and way more concentrated. It's basically the difference between casting a giant net and using a scalpel.
So, if we're going to get targeted, who exactly are we talking about? Who is in this group? Well, the analysis points to a pretty specific slice of the population that's facing the toughest financial battles.
The starting point is a number that's, well, it's kind of hard to ignore. 40 million. Right now, there are 40 million people in this country living in poverty. That is a staggering figure all by itself. But believe it or not, that 40 million is just the beginning. When you widen the lens just a little bit to include people who are very low income, the ones living just a hair above the poverty line, that number explodes to about 100 million people. Let that sink in. That means for every 3 people you meet, one of them is struggling in a pretty significant way.
All right, let's talk money, because when you actually run the numbers, the argument for being more targeted gets incredibly clear. So how do the costs really compare?
So check this out. To send a one-time $1,400 check to 50 million of the most vulnerable people, that would cost around $70 billion. If you expand that to the full 100 million people living in or near poverty, you're looking at about $140 billion. Now, I know, these are massive numbers, but context is everything here.
And here is where that context just becomes jaw-dropping. That targeted check for 50 million people, $70 billion. The last universal check that went out, a colossal $358 billion. The difference isn't just big, it's on a completely different planet.
Let me put that another way, because this is really the heart of the whole financial argument. For the price of that one universal check, you could send five separate checks to the 50 million people who need it the absolute most. Just imagine that. The potential for providing sustained, meaningful help is just, wow, it's on a whole other level.
But of course, anytime you talk about sending out billions of dollars, there's always that one huge question that hangs over the entire conversation, and that's inflation. What would this kind of spending actually do to the economy?
It's the critical question, right? Wouldn't pumping even $70 or $140 billion into the economy make prices spike for everyone? I mean, that's what a lot of folks think happened with the last few rounds of stimulus.
Well, the argument here is that it all comes down to how the money gets spent. People with low incomes are way more likely to use that money for immediate, essential needs. We're talking about groceries, keeping the lights on, paying for medicine, or just trying to pay down some debt. They're not running out to buy new TVs or book vacations.
So here's the crucial point. Because this money is going straight to essentials, to covering costs that already exist, it helps people stay afloat without necessarily overheating the whole economy. This analysis suggests the impacts on inflation would be negligible. That's a huge contrast to universal checks, which can definitely fuel widespread consumer spending and drive up prices.
And that really brings us to the final thought here. What we've walked through is a case built on some pretty simple math and really clear data. It suggests that by focusing our help where it's needed most, we could actually have a much bigger impact for a fraction of the cost. So the question it leaves us with is this: could this data-driven approach be the blueprint for how we handle economic support from now on?
The next 8 days, well, they're going to be absolutely pivotal. A whole series of key economic reports are about to drop, and they will directly, and I mean directly, impact the size of your 2025 benefit increase. Think of this as the final weather forecast before the big storm, except this time we're forecasting your money. And we're here to break down exactly what's at stake. The stakes for Friday's report are just incredibly high. A strong report, one that shows a lot of hiring, tells us the economy is on pretty solid ground. But a weak report? That could signal serious trouble ahead. Last month's report, for instance, was super low. What's even more concerning is that the 2 months before that were revised down to incredibly low numbers. So if those numbers get revised down again on Friday, we could actually be looking at negative job growth. And that, my friends, is a massive red flag for recession. It would mean we are way closer to the edge of an economic cliff than a lot of people realize. Ultimately, the data we're about to get does way more than just calculate your COLA. It will heavily, heavily influence the Federal Reserve's next decision on interest rates. And here's why that matters to you. If the jobs report is strong and inflation is high, the Fed is probably not going to cut interest rates. But if the jobs report is weak and inflation is low, they might be encouraged to cut rates to help stimulate the economy.
And lower interest rates make it cheaper for all of us to borrow money for cars, homes, business loans, which encourages spending and can give the economy a little boost. Right now, a lot of people are predicting a rate cut, so you can bet the Fed will be looking at these next two reports very, very closely.
So that's really this central question we're facing, isn't it? Will the data from these next days confirm a solid benefit increase for 2025, or is it going to start flashing warning signs about the health of the economy? The numbers released this week and next, they're going to provide the answer. They're setting the financial stage for 2025, and we'll be watching right alongside you.
So are we getting another stimulus check? Come on, it's the question that's on everybody's mind, right? Especially if you're on a fixed income. But what if I told you the answer isn't buried in politics? It's actually hidden in plain sight, in the economic data. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain and find the one key trigger that actually makes these checks a reality.
This is the big one. It's the question we're all asking. After everything we've been through, it just feels like everyone is wondering when, or even if, more help is ever going to be on the way. Well, instead of just guessing, we're going to look at the exact same signals the people in charge are watching. It's time to see what might really be coming over the horizon.
Okay, so before we can look ahead, we have to get one really important thing straight. And, it might not be what you want to hear, but believe me, understanding this is the absolute most critical piece of the entire puzzle.
And here it is. The bottom line is, it doesn't matter how many petitions get signed or how loudly people demand more help, none of that directly triggers a stimulus check. The one thing, the only thing that acts as the catalyst is the health of the U.S. economy. Period.
Now look, I know that might sound a little discouraging at first, but it's actually the complete opposite. It's empowering. It means we can stop getting caught up in all the political noise and start looking at the real data, the same stuff the policymakers are looking at. It changes everything from just, hoping for help to actually understanding the conditions that make that help necessary.
So, if it's all about the economy, what are those conditions? What should we be looking for? Well, this brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today, the economic trigger. Let's break down exactly how this thing works.
The key idea here is something called an inverse correlation. Now, don't let the fancy term fool you. It's actually super simple. Just think of a seesaw, right? When one side goes up, the other side has to go down. It's the same here. When the health of the economy goes down, the chances of the government sending out stimulus checks goes up. They move in opposite directions. Simple as that. Think about it. When the economy is just humming along, jobs are everywhere, businesses are growing, there's basically zero chance of stimulus. And why would there be? You don't need to stimulate an economy that's already running hot. But when things start to slow down, when the economy looks like it's heading for a recession, that's when the whole conversation in Washington completely changes.
So what exactly should you be watching for? Well, here are the big four signals. First, rising unemployment claims. That's a big one. When more people are losing their jobs, it's a clear sign of trouble. Then you've got slowing growth and contracting business activity, which just means companies are making less and selling less. But honestly, the real flashing red light to watch for is the Federal Reserve. When they start cutting interest rates, you need to pay attention. They only do that when they see big trouble on the horizon and want to make it cheaper to borrow money to get things going again. These are the headlines that truly matter.
And look, this isn't just some theory somebody came up with. The data shows a crystal clear, repeating pattern throughout recent American history. It's kind of undeniable once you see it.
Let that sink in for a second. Every single major recession in the modern era has led to stimulus checks. That tells us that these payments aren't random acts of kindness. They're a standard, almost predictable response to a specific crisis, a major economic downturn. The playbook is there, and they've used it again and again. Let's just walk through it. Back in 2001, the dot-com bubble burst, and we had a recession. The response? $300 checks. Okay. 7 years later, 2008, the housing market completely collapses, triggering a massive global crisis. The response? $600 checks. Then, of course, 2020, the pandemic shuts down the entire world. The response? $1,200 checks. Are you seeing the pattern here? A major recession hits, and boom, payments go out. It has happened every single time.
But hold on, because if we look just a little bit closer at those numbers, something even more interesting and kind of wild starts to pop out. It's not just that they sent checks, it's the amount of money that tells a whole other story.
Okay, so the first time, in 2001, the baseline was set, $300.
Then in 2008, when the next big crisis hit, what happened? The amount exactly doubled to $600.
And in 2020, you already know where this is going. It doubled again to $1,200. I mean, come on, that's not a coincidence. That is a clear mathematical pattern playing out over 2 decades. Each payment was literally double the one that came before it.
All right, so now we're armed with the two biggest clues. We know about the economic trigger, and we've seen this incredible historical pattern. So what can we reasonably guess about what might be coming next?
This is the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we were to face another major recession in the near future, would the people in charge stick to this exact same doubling pattern that's held true for more than 20 years?
Well, if you just follow the math to its next logical step, you double $1,200 and you get $2,400. Now, let's be crystal clear about this. This is not a prediction. It's just pointing out a very curious historical trend. But it is a fascinating pattern to think about, isn't it? All of this really leads to one powerful, simple takeaway. If you want to have a real idea of what's coming, you can pretty much ignore the political shouting matches. The real answers are in the jobs reports, the GDP numbers, and what the Federal Reserve is doing. You now know exactly what to look for. The real signs that history shows us come right before these payments.
And here's one final crucial warning. When these things happen, they happen fast. I mean, think back to early 2020. In February, everything seemed pretty normal. By March, the entire world had changed. And by April, checks were already on their way. The shift from a stable economy to a crisis can happen in just a few weeks. When the dominoes start to fall, they fall quickly.
So, when you put it all together, history seems to show us that a major stimulus payment isn't really a question of if, but a question of when a recession forces the government's hand. The focus shifts away from waiting for politicians to make an announcement and toward watching the economy itself. So the real question I have for you is, now that you know what to look for, what economic signs will you be watching?
So today we're going to tackle a huge question, one that's been on everyone's mind for a while now. Is another stimulus check actually on the table?
All right, let's just get right into it, shall we? This is the big one. It's the question that keeps popping up. And while there's a ton of speculation and noise out there, the sources we've looked at point to a surprisingly clear set of conditions that would have to be met.
And here's the bottom line right up front. This isn't really about politics or promises. According to the source material, a future check depends completely on specific economic triggers. Think of it this way. If the economy gets sick enough, the government views a stimulus check as the medicine it needs to recover.
So what exactly are these triggers? What science is the government actually looking for? Let's break down the key indicators that would have to be flashing red before another payment would even be on the radar.
Okay, so the first big one is something you've probably heard of, a recession. Now that has a pretty technical definition. It means the economy shrinks for 2 3-month periods in a row. And what's really interesting is that based on recent data, the US economy actually hit this benchmark. But here's the kicker. That alone wasn't enough to get the checks rolling.
And that's because, even with a technical recession, the sources are crystal clear that the job market is the ultimate decider. This is the key, the linchpin, as one source put it. Seriously, everything hinges on whether people are working.
It all makes sense when you think about it, right? It's all connected. When people have jobs, they spend money. When they spend money, businesses do well. And of course, the government gets tax revenue. But when jobs disappear, well, that whole economic engine just starts to sputter and stall. That's why those monthly job reports are watched so incredibly closely. So let's be super clear about the motivation here, according to the sources. It's not just about being generous. A stimulus check is a tool. It's like a shot of adrenaline for the economy. The whole point is to get you to spend that money, like right away, to kickstart that engine and get it turning over again.
Okay, so let's play this out. Let's say the economy does get sick enough and those triggers get pulled. What would a stimulus check even look like? Who would get one and for how much? Well, history actually gives us some really good clues.
First off, just think about how many people we're talking about here. The last few times this happened, the checks reached a staggering 85% of the entire US population. So this isn't some small targeted program. If it happens, it's designed to be a massive, widespread event.
And based on those past rounds, the sources say you can pretty much bet that folks on a fixed income would be included. We're talking people receiving Social Security, disability, VA benefits, railroad retirement, you name it. The precedent is just so strong that it's almost a given these groups would be part of any plan.
Now for the big question, how much? The number that probably pops into your head first is $1,400, right? And that's simply because it was the amount of the very last payment that went out.
But that's not the only number floating around. There's been a lot of talk about a higher amount, maybe a nice round $2,000, which has been part of a few different proposals that have been discussed.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The sources point out this historical trend. If you actually look at the pattern, the way the payments have increased over the last few recessions, the next logical number in that sequence would actually be $2,400. Kind of makes you think, huh?
Okay, but all of this, who gets it, how much, it all comes down to the biggest question of all: when? And the timing isn't just pulled out of a hat. The sources show it's all about one thing: just how bad things get.
So, the sources kind of paint two different pictures here. On one hand, you could have a mild recession, the economy takes a little dip, but then it bounces right back pretty quickly. In that case, the chances of a check? Pretty slim. But then you have the other scenario, a deep recession, the kind where the economy, as one source dramatically put it, falls off a cliff. In that situation, the likelihood of a check becomes very, very high.
And this brings us to what is probably the most compelling point of all. Just look at the history. Every single recession the U.S. has had in the 21st century, in 2001, 2008, and 2020, every single time it's been followed by the government issuing stimulus checks. The pattern is, well, it's hard to ignore.
So, what does this all mean for you? What should you be watching? The source material basically says to keep your eye on three main things. First and foremost, the job market. If you see unemployment numbers start to really climb, that is the #1 red flag. Second, those GDP reports. Is the economy still shrinking? And third, watch the Federal Reserve and what they're doing with interest rates. These are the real-world signals that will tell you if another check is moving from maybe to very likely.
And we absolutely have to end with a really important dose of reality here. As of right now, today, none of this is official. No new stimulus check has been approved. This is all based on analyzing economic patterns and historical data. Nothing is set in stone.
Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We've seen that every single recession in the last 20-plus years has triggered a stimulus payment. And we see the economy is showing some clear signs of strain. So, is another check really a question of if it will happen, or is it just a question of when?
You go online and it seems like everyone is talking about one thing. Is a fourth stimulus check on the way? Well, the real answer, it turns out, isn't a simple yes or no, and it's definitely not a date on a calendar. Today, we're going to dig in and figure out what actually needs to happen for another check to even be a possibility. Okay, so this is it, right? This is the big one, the question on everyone's mind, and it's especially critical if you're on a fixed income, Social Security, SSDI, VA benefits. That hope for another payment is really, really strong. But to get a real answer, we've got to look beyond the headlines and get a handle on the economic reality of the situation. And honestly, this is the most important idea to grasp. A stimulus check isn't some scheduled payment. It's not a holiday bonus. It's an emergency tool, like a fire extinguisher in a glass case. Lawmakers don't just wake up one day and decide to send out money. Something major has to happen to force their hand. So the question isn't when, it's why. And that why? It's all about the health of the U.S. economy. So what are these big economic triggers? If you look back, every major stimulus payment we've ever gotten has been a reaction to a crisis. It's never proactive. So to figure out what might be coming, we have to learn to watch the same economic vital signs that the folks in Washington are looking at. I love this analogy because it makes it so clear. When the economy, our patient, is healthy and doing well, you don't give it medicine, right? Of course not. But when it gets sick, when it slides into a recession, that's when lawmakers reach for the medicine cabinet. And that stimulus is the dose they use to try and get things moving again. The sicker the patient, well, the bigger the dose of medicine. Now, of all the vital signs they check, the job market is, without a doubt, the most critical. It's the big one. See, when people are working, money is flowing, the economy is humming along. But the second you see widespread layoffs and rising unemployment, that is a massive flashing red flag that the entire system is in trouble. That's the one thing that gets everyone's attention. And the way we measure this is with something called the official jobs report. You might hear it on the news as the non-farm payroll report. It comes out on the first Friday of every single month, and it gives us this incredibly detailed picture of what's happening with jobs all across the country. So what's actually in this thing? Well, first, it's got the national unemployment rate. Is it going up, down? That's huge. Then it tells us exactly how many jobs were created or, and this is the scary part, how many were lost that month. It even looks at average hourly earnings. Are people's wages growing or are they stuck? And finally, the labor force participation rate. Basically, what percentage of Americans are actually working or trying to find work? If you see all these numbers turn negative and stay negative for a few months in a row, that's the clearest sign that our patient is getting sick.
And this isn't just some abstract theory. If we look back at recent history, there's an undeniable pattern. Major economic problems have been followed consistently by stimulus payments. It's like a playbook they've used over and over again. Just look at this timeline. It lays it out perfectly. Back in 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, the government sent out $300 checks. Then you fast forward to 2008, the huge housing crisis, the Great Recession. That amount doubled to $600. And then, of course, 2020. The pandemic shuts down the entire world economy, and that first check was $1,200. See the trend? Every single time a massive economic crisis was followed by cash payments directly to the people.
You see it, right? It's not just that they sent checks. Look at the amounts. From $300 to $600, it doubled. From $600 to $1,200, it doubled again. Now, look, history isn't always a perfect predictor, but that's a pretty interesting trajectory. It suggests that with each new crisis, lawmakers felt the need for a bigger and bigger dose of that economic medicine. So, does this mean the next check would automatically be $2,400? Well, not so fast. This is just us looking at a historical pattern. It's pure speculation. Any future amount would depend entirely on how bad the next crisis is. A mild recession might only call for a small check, but a really deep economic collapse, a number like this could definitely be on the table. The size of the check is always tied to the size of the problem.
And that brings us to another really critical idea. It's not just about how much money, it's about how it's sent out. See, the last few rounds of checks went to something like 85% of all Americans. But there's a growing argument that maybe, just maybe, that broad shotgun approach isn't the smartest way to do it. Let's compare these two ideas. Broad relief, that's what we're used to, goes to almost everybody. The problem is, a lot of people who get it don't really need it, so they save it. That doesn't help the economy, and it can actually push inflation higher. The other idea is targeted relief. This would focus the money only on low and fixed income folks, the people who are guaranteed to go out and spend it right away on necessities. This gives you way more bang for your buck with less risk of inflation. It could even mean multiple smaller payments over time instead of just one big one. And that is the absolute fundamental truth of all of this. We have to remember this. A stimulus check is not meant to be a contribution to your savings account. The entire purpose, the only purpose, is to get you to spend it. They want that money flowing through stores and businesses immediately. Buying food, paying bills, getting your car fixed. That spending is the jolt of electricity the economy needs to snap out of a recession. Okay, so let's put this all together. Instead of listening to rumors online, here's a clear, simple dashboard of what you should actually be watching for. These are the real signals. Think of it as a three-step domino effect. First, you'd see the warning signs. That monthly jobs report would start showing really bad numbers. Month after month, job losses, unemployment taking up a lot. Second, after enough bad data, the experts would make it official. We are in a recession. And third, it's only then, when the crisis is real and undeniable, that you'd see lawmakers in Congress finally scramble to put a stimulus package together, which would probably include direct payments.
So, the bottom line, the most crucial takeaway from all of this is this. Right now, with the economy as it is, a fourth stimulus check just isn't happening. The trigger isn't an online petition, it's not a politician's promise. The only trigger is a real, measurable, and significant economic crisis, one that's bad enough to force Congress to act. Understanding this lets you see past all the noise and know exactly what to look for.
And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. We've seen the stimulus playbook change over time, right? The amounts got bigger, and now we're talking about new, more targeted strategies. So as our economy keeps evolving and faces new and different challenges, how will the government's medicine have to adapt to actually keep working? Something to think about. Let's talk about stimulus checks. You know, that money that shows up in your bank account from the government during a crisis? It feels like a really modern thing. But what we're going to do today is take a deep dive into the surprisingly long, winding, 100-year story of how this idea went from totally radical to a central part of our economy.
Yeah, really. Most of us, when we hear stimulus, we think of 2008 or, of course, the recent pandemic. But the policies we see today are actually the final product of decades and decades of economic experiments, huge debates, and political battles. To really get how we got here, we have to go way back, all the way back to the beginning.
So our journey starts in the 1930s.
America is in the absolute grip of the Great Depression. And this wasn't just a recession. It was a crisis so big, so deep, that it forced everyone to completely rethink what the government's job even was when it came to the economy and its own people. I mean, just try to imagine this. 1 out of every 4 people who could work couldn't find a job. The entire system was on the verge of breaking down. And that old idea that, the economy would just magically fix itself, well, that was clearly not happening. Out of that desperation, a brand new way of thinking took over. The government had to do something. And this, right here, was a revolutionary shift, a total game changer. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal didn't actually create stimulus checks, but it did something arguably more important. It established the core principle that makes them possible. The idea that the government has a fundamental duty to step in and create an economic safety net for its citizens. This was the philosophical seed for absolutely everything that came after. And this philosophy wasn't just talk. It was put into action through these enormous programs. The CCC and the WPA, they put millions of people back to work on public projects. And of course, the Social Security Act created that foundational safety net for older Americans. Now, these weren't direct cash payments to everyone, but they set a massive precedent. The government could and should pump money into the economy by directly helping people. The groundwork was officially laid.
Okay, so after World War II, America gets this huge boom of prosperity. But the painful lessons from the Depression were definitely not forgotten. This is when economists started to develop the actual theories, the blueprints, really, that would turn the New Deal's broad philosophy into a real policy toolkit.
And the most important blueprint came from an economist you've probably heard of, John Maynard Keynes. His big idea was actually pretty simple but incredibly powerful. Consumer spending is what drives the economy. So the economy is in a nosedive. The government has to be the one to jumpstart it by spending money, even if it means going into debt, to get people spending again. It's like giving the economic engine a boost. This theory would dominate the field for decades.
But as you can see, this idea took a while to evolve. The New Deal in the 30s set the stage. Then in 1964, we see the first big test of Keynesian theory with a major tax cut. But the real breakthrough moment, that came in 1975. The U.S. was facing another recession, and the government sent out a 1-year tax rebate. They didn't call it a stimulus check, but that's exactly what it was, a direct payment to households to get them to go out and spend. The modern stimulus check had just been born.
So the late 20th century became this period of trial and error, because in the 1970s, a new problem popped up called stagflation. That's where you have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. It was a mess, and it really challenged those simple Keynesian models. It made policymakers realize they needed more sophisticated tools in their toolbox. There wasn't just one magic fix. And this led to the great economic debate of the 1980s. On one side, you had the demand-siders, the Keynesians, who said, give money to consumers, they'll spend it, and that will drive the economy. But on the other side, you had supply-side economics, which you might know as Reaganomics. Their idea was, no, cut taxes for businesses and the wealthy, they'll invest that money, build more stuff, and that will drive the economy. This fundamental disagreement about who to help, the consumer or the producer, really shaped policy for years.
But eventually, the pendulum swung back to helping the consumer, but with a new, smarter twist: targeted stimulus. Economists and policymakers realize that lower-income families are way more likely to spend an extra dollar right away than wealthier families are. So the goal became, how do we get the most bang for our buck? Well, by sending money directly to the people who will get it back into the economy the fastest. This was a huge innovation, making stimulus more efficient. And that brings us right up to the 21st century. This is where all these theories, all these decades of debate got put to the test like never before. A series of massive global crises forced the government to act on a scale that was pretty much unimaginable, and the stimulus check finally truly came of age. The first huge test was the 2008 financial crisis. The response? The Economic Stimulus Act, which sent $96 billion out in checks to American households. And what was so important about this was that it was the first time that direct payments were the main tool in the rescue package. It was a pure, direct application of that targeted Keynesian theory.
But as we all know, the 2008 crisis was deep, and it turned out more help was needed. So just 1 year later, in 2009, came the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And look at that number, a staggering $787 billion.
This was a much more complex package that mixed direct payments with big money for infrastructure projects and aid to state governments. They were fighting the crisis on every front.
And then COVID-19 hit. The global shutdown of the economy triggered a response that was absolutely historic. We saw 3 major stimulus packages in 2020 and 2021. The direct payments alone, just the checks, totaled over $867 billion. We're talking more than 476 million individual payments sent out. The sheer scale of it was just breathtaking. And what's wild is how quickly the whole system evolved in just 13 years. You can see it right here. The payments got bigger, the targeting got way more sophisticated, going from just simple income levels to using really complex data. And the technology, it went from mostly paper checks being mailed out in 2008 to near instantaneous mass direct deposits during the pandemic. With each crisis, the system got bigger, it got faster, and it got smarter.
But as the checks got bigger and the tech got better, something else changed pretty dramatically: the politics. You see, that 2008 stimulus passed with pretty solid support from both parties. It was seen as a necessary emergency response. But by 2020, you could see that agreement starting to crack. And by the time the American Rescue Plan passed in 2021, support was almost entirely down party lines. The political fight to get these massive aid packages passed has gotten way, way tougher.
Okay, so after this 100-year journey, all the trial and error, all the evolution, what have we actually learned? When the next crisis hits, what are the key takeaways for policymakers? Well, our history actually gives us a pretty clear roadmap. Looking back, 5 key lessons really stand out. Number 1, timing. You have to act fast because hesitating just makes the problem worse. 2, targeting. You get more impact if you get money to the people who'll spend it the fastest. 3, size matters. A small solution for a big problem just won't work. 4, technology is a game changer. Modern systems can deliver help with incredible speed. And finally, number 5, politics. You can have the best economic theory in the world, but it doesn't mean a thing if you can't get the votes to pass the bill.
And really, this quote just gets to the absolute heart of it all. When you strip away all the economic jargon and the political debates, this 100-year story has really been about one thing: finding better and faster ways to help real people get through a crisis. It's about providing some stability when everything feels like it's falling apart.
So, where does the story go from here? Well, it's definitely not over. Economists are already talking about things like automatic stimulus, payments that would trigger automatically based on economic data, with no political debate needed. They're talking about digital currencies that could make payments happen literally in an instant. As our world keeps changing, you can bet the tools we use to protect our economy will keep changing too. The next chapter is already being written.
Straight to the facts on stimulus money. You've got questions. Is more on the way? How much could it be? And what does it all really mean for you? Well, let's break it down nice and simple.
Okay, let's just dive right into the big one, right? This is the question that's on everybody's mind. It's probably why you're here. And you know what? I'm not going to make you wait for the answer. Every time things feel a little shaky out there, this is the question that pops up. So, what's the deal? And there it is. The straight, honest-to-goodness truth is not yet. Right now, as we speak, no new federal stimulus checks have been approved. There's no bill, no money in the mail. But, and this is a really big but, that is not where the story ends. Not even close. The government has sent out stimulus money before, and the exact same reasons they did it then, well, they could definitely happen again. So the real question isn't just if, it's when, and what are the signs we should all be looking out for? So how do we spot the shift? How do we know when the conversation goes from not yet to it's coming? Well, it turns out there are some really clear signals. You can think of them like an economic weather forecast. No one's got a crystal ball, but history shows us there are specific things that happen that get politicians talking seriously about sending out more checks. So, what are these triggers? It really boils down to 4 main signals. First, you've got to keep an eye on the unemployment rate. If that number starts to creep up towards, say, 6 or even 7%, that's a huge red flag. Then there's just a general significant slowdown in the economy. The third, politics, of course. An election year always ramps up the pressure. And finally, maybe the most powerful one, public pressure. When enough people start demanding help, Washington eventually has to listen. Okay, so we know the signs to look for, but let's get down to the why. Why does stimulus checks even happen in the first place? It's not just some random giveaway. It's a very specific tool that economists use to stop a really dangerous problem, what they call a vicious economic cycle. So let's take a look at what that actually is.
This right here is the dangerous downward spiral that keeps economists up at night. It's a feedback loop. See, it all starts when folks have less money in their pockets. Naturally, they stop buying as much stuff. Well, that directly hurts businesses, right? So what do? They have to lay people off. And that, of course, means even more people have less money. And you can see how the cycle just keeps feeding on itself, pulling the entire economy down. So how do you stop a spiral like that? Well, a stimulus check is designed to be like a wrench thrown into the gears of that cycle. By putting cash directly into millions of bank accounts, the government is basically hitting the reset button. The whole idea is that you'll take that money and spend it right away on things you need: groceries, gas, rent, and that spending goes straight to businesses, which helps them keep the lights on and, crucially, keep their employees on the payroll. It's all about turning that vicious cycle into a virtuous one.
All right, now for the part I know you've been waiting for. If, and that's still an if, another round of stimulus happens, how much money are we really talking about here? The good news is we don't have to just pull a number out of thin air. We can actually look back at the past payments, and believe me, a very clear pattern starts to show up.
This timeline really tells the whole story, doesn't it? Back in 2008, the payments were pretty modest. But look at what happened during the pandemic. They grew, and they grew significantly. We went from $1,200 in 2020 all the way up to $1,400 for every single person in a household in late 2021. The pattern is kind of undeniable. When the government decides to act, the trend has been to go bigger and bigger. Let's just sit with this number for a second. $5,600. That is what a family of four got in that single largest round of stimulus. Think about what that actually means for a real family. For a lot of people, that's 4, maybe 5 months of rent. That could be an entire year of car payments. It could be months and months of groceries and bills. We're not talking about a little boost here. We're talking about a genuine lifeline. It's breathing room. That's the kind of real-world impact these numbers have. So why the big jump in the payment amounts? Well, it all comes down to this kind of wonky economic idea called the marginal propensity to consume. Don't worry, it sounds way more complicated than it is. All it really means is this. If I give you an extra dollar, are you more likely to spend it or save it? And what all the studies show is that people with less in savings, people living paycheck to paycheck, they spend that money like immediately. For a stimulus to work, the government needs that money out in the economy now. And that's why they go big. A $1,400 check is much more likely to get spent on immediate needs than a smaller $600 one. It's just that simple. This brings us to another super important question. If checks do go out, who actually gets one? And one of the most consistent things we've seen is that these programs tend to be incredibly broad. The whole point is to get money flowing fast, and the easiest way to do that is to include just about everybody. So here's the good news. Usually the eligibility is really, really wide. It's not just for people who are unemployed. Working folks, retirees, people on disability, they've all typically qualified in the past. The main target is the broad middle class. So unless you're a really high income earner, chances are you'd be on the list. And what about how fast you get the money? Because let's be real, if you need help, you need it now, not months from now. And thankfully, this is where the system has gotten so much better. I mean, back in 2008, it took months to get paper checks in the mail. Fast forward to 2021, and the IRS was getting money into people's bank accounts via direct deposit within days of a law being signed. That's a huge improvement. Okay, so we've talked about the why, the when, the how much, and the who. But here's the thing. You don't just have to sit back and wait to see what happens. There are actual concrete things you can do right now to make sure you're ready to go if and when another payment gets approved. Let's walk through your action plan. Look, it's a simple 4-step plan. This is all about being proactive instead of reactive. It puts you in the best possible spot. And let's kick it off with what I think is the most important practical step of all, just being ready. These 3 things seem small, but they are incredibly powerful. First, make sure the IRS has your current mailing address. More importantly, check that your direct deposit information, your bank account info, is up to date. That's the secret to getting paid in days instead of weeks. And finally, file your taxes. I know, nobody likes doing it, but even if you don't owe a dime, filing gets you into the IRS system, so any future payments can be sent to you automatically. Whew, we have covered a ton of ground here, right? We've looked at the economic signs, the history, the politics, and the practical steps you can take. So after all of that, let's circle all the way back to the beginning and ask one more time, what's the real bottom line here?
And here it is, plain and simple. It really just comes down to two things: need and pressure. If those economic warning lights we talked about, like rising unemployment, start flashing red, the need for help will be obvious. And if enough of us are feeling that pain and make our voices heard, the political pressure will be impossible to ignore. And when those two things come together, history tells us that more checks become not just a possibility, but a probability.
And you know, this might be the most important takeaway of all. It is so easy to get caught up waiting and hoping for help to arrive. But this idea right here, this puts the power right back where it belongs, with you. A stimulus check can be a huge help, an absolute lifeline, but it's not a long-term plan. So the real question I want to leave you with is this: what's one thing you can do this week, stimulus or not, to take control and build a stronger financial future for yourself?
What if, instead of sending checks to almost everyone, we sent out fewer checks but made them way more powerful? We're talking about ongoing, monthly payments, but, and this is the key part, only for a very specific group of people. Let's get into it. All right, first up, let's just take a second and think back to 2020 and 2021. Remember those 3 big stimulus checks? A lot of us got them, and for some people, they were an absolute lifeline. But the big question this new report is asking is, was that really the best way to do it? Could we have gotten a bigger economic bang for our buck, with fewer negative side effects?
So the approach back then was, well, it was broad. I mean, incredibly broad. We're talking about checks going out to something like 85% of the entire U.S. population. The idea was pretty simple, right? Just get money into as many hands as possible, as fast as possible. But as this report points out, that kind of blanket approach, it came with a massive kind of hidden cost.
And what was that cost? Well, in a word, inflation. According to this study, printing and just sending out trillions of dollars to almost everyone is a huge reason we saw that crazy inflation and all the supply chain chaos. The report uses a great analogy. It was like flooding an engine. Just too much, too fast, all at once. So if that didn't work perfectly, what's the alternative?
Okay, so to really get what this new proposal is all about, we got to wrap our heads around one core economic idea. And it's actually pretty simple. It's this: not every dollar is spent the same way. The way different people use a new dollar they get, well, that's the whole secret to making a stimulus plan actually work.
All right, so here's the fancy economic term for it: marginal propensity to consume, or MPC for short. Now I know, that sounds super complicated, but I promise it's not. It really just boils down to one simple question. If I handed you an extra dollar right now, what would you do with it? Would you spend it right away on groceries, gas, bills, or would you stick it in your savings account? That one little concept, that's the foundation for this whole new way of thinking about stimulus.
So this study kind of breaks people down into 3 main groups based on this MPC idea. First up, you've got your high MPC folks. These are generally lower income people who, look, when they get an extra buck, it's got to go right back out the door for necessities. Then you've got the medium MPC group. This is often your middle income crowd. They'll spend some of it, for sure, but they're probably going to save a good chunk of it too. And finally, you have the low MPC group. These are your high income individuals. An extra dollar for them, it's much, much more likely to get saved or invested instead of spent. So you see the pattern, right? The more money you make, the less likely you are to immediately spend the next dollar you get.
And this right here, this is really the heart of the matter. A stimulus check, it isn't supposed to be a gift. The whole point is right there in the name, to stimulate the economy. And for that to happen, what needs to happen? The money has to be spent. It has to move. And as you can see, giving a dollar to someone in that high MPC group, well, you get the most bang for your buck immediately. Over 80 cents of that dollar goes right back into the economy. That effect gets smaller and smaller with the other groups. So the bottom line is pretty clear. If you want maximum stimulus, you got to give the money to the people who are going to spend it.
Okay, so now that we've got this MPC thing down, we can look at the actual plan this report is proposing for the next time the economy takes a nosedive. And it is a radically different approach. It's laser-focused, super efficient, and, they argue, way more powerful.
And the big number at the center of this whole thing? $2,000. But get this, it's not a one-time check. The proposal is for $2,000 a month, an ongoing payment designed to create real stability and a continuous flow of spending into the economy.
Now here's the crucial part. This is not for everyone. The plan is super targeted. It's aimed specifically at low-income and fixed-income folks. Think people on Social Security, disability, SSI, and VA benefits. And why them? Well, it's exactly what we just talked about. This is the high MPC group. These are the people who will take that money and, out of necessity, immediately put it back into the economy. And it's not a forever thing either. It's designed as a temporary fix, just for a few months during a really bad recession, to basically jumpstart the economic engine.
So you might be asking, okay, what's the big advantage of this laser-focused approach? Well, it's simple. You get a much bigger bang for your buck, a much bigger economic impact for a surprisingly smaller price tag. It's really about being strategic, instead of just dropping cash from a helicopter and hoping for the best.
Let's just compare these two approaches side by side, because this really puts it all into perspective. The old way, checks to 85% of the country, costing nearly $1 trillion. And the result, the report argues, was a ton of inflation. The new proposal, you target a much smaller group, maybe 50 to 100 million people, the ones who need it the most and will spend it the fastest. The total cost? A few $100 billion. So you get a faster, more direct boost to the economy, you help the people who are most vulnerable, and you do it all for a fraction of the cost and with way, way less risk of causing that crazy inflation.
Okay, now I have to be super clear about this next part. This is really important. As fascinating as this idea is, right now it is just that, an idea, a proposal. This is not a current government policy.
In fact, the report itself says it directly, and I'm quoting here, a $2,000 check has not been approved right now. So I just want to make sure everyone understands, this is a research paper, it's not an active program you can sign up for.
So what's the point of all this then? Well, the real value here isn't about a check that's coming in the mail tomorrow. The value is that this is a potential blueprint for the future. It's a detailed, data-driven game plan that policymakers can look at the next time we hit a big economic crisis. It's really all about learning from what happened last time so we can have a smarter, better, and less damaging response in the future.
And that really leaves us with one big final question to think about. Instead of these huge, broad, one-size-fits-all solutions, could this be the future? Is this kind of smart, targeted, data-driven support the new way we handle economic recovery? This report, for one, makes a really compelling case that it just might be.
Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not just going to talk about stimulus money. We're going to talk about strategy. We're going to turn all that uncertainty into a solid game plan so you can absolutely maximize the benefit from any economic relief program that might come your way. For so many of us, getting a government stimulus check can feel, it can feel like a game of chance, right? You hear some rumors, you're glued to the news, and you basically just sit there and hope for the best. It feels like it's all just luck and timing that you have zero control over. But what if I told you it's a lot more like a game of chess than just a random roll of the dice? What if by actually understanding the board and knowing the rules, you could get a serious advantage, not just in getting the money, but in making it work for you for the long haul? That is the exact game plan we're going to build together, starting right now. Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to talk about what it means to win the stimulus game. Then, we'll get into understanding the rules. After that, we'll cover proactive preparation, how to maximize what you get, and finally, how you can become a true stimulus champion. First up, winning the stimulus game. This is all about making that critical mental shift, moving from being a passive person waiting for things to happen to being an active, strategic player in control. Believe it or not, these stimulus programs follow some surprisingly predictable patterns. Getting a handle on these 4 core rules is your first and honestly your most powerful strategic advantage. So let's break them down. This right here, this demystifies the whole thing. First, timing. The money gets sent out in waves. Direct deposits are always the fastest, sometimes hitting your account within a week. But paper checks and those debit cards, that can take weeks, maybe even months. Knowing this helps you manage your cash flow. Second, amounts. They almost always follow a formula. A base amount, maybe $1,200, maybe $1,400, plus extra for any dependents. This lets you kind of sketch out a budget before you even know for sure. Third, eligibility. This almost always comes down to your adjusted gross income from your most recent tax return. That one number is what decides if you qualify. And finally, distribution. Look, having your direct deposit info updated with the IRS is the #1 best way to get paid fast. Period. These aren't secrets. They're literally the rules of the game. So knowing the rules is one thing, but actually acting on them, that's what takes us to the next super critical phase, proactive preparation. This is how you get all your pieces in place before the game even starts. It's what separates the pros from the amateurs. So this slide lays it out perfectly. There are 2 kinds of players. Which one are you? The reactive recipient waits for the news, then scrambles when they realize their check is going to an old bank account. They're always reacting to problems. But the strategic player? They anticipate. They see the writing on the wall, they keep their info updated every year just as a habit, and they already have a plan for the money before it even shows up. One is constantly playing defense, always a step behind. The other is playing offense, ready for whatever comes next.
And that preparation, it's really built on these 3 pillars. Financial prep is your foundation. You've got to file your taxes every single year, even if you don't owe anything. This puts you on the grid. It makes sure they have your current info. Knowledge prep is all about intelligence gathering. You start watching for economic triggers, like a jump in unemployment or a drop in the GDP. That's just the total value of everything a country produces. These are the signals that often come before any stimulus talks. And community prep is your network. Get in touch with local nonprofits or community groups. They often know about local programs and can help you avoid scams.
All right, you've played your opening moves perfectly. The money has arrived. Now, this is where the real strategy begins. How to maximize winnings isn't just about getting the check. It's about using it to create real, lasting improvement in your financial life. So, what is the smartest way to actually use this money? This framework is your guide. Notice that about half of it goes to immediate needs, food, rent, keeping the lights on, that's crucial. But the other half is for building your future. A good chunk, maybe 20 to 30%, should go to debt reduction. Attack that high-interest credit card debt first. Paying that down is like giving yourself a raise. Another 20 to 30% is for strategic investments. This could be anything from a certification class to a car repair that you need to get to work, or just starting a small emergency fund. And yeah, that last little slice for quality of life, that's important too. Reducing stress is a huge part of long-term financial health. This timeline tells you exactly when to make each move. Right now, in the pre-crisis phase, you should be making sure your info is up to date. When you see those early warnings in the economy, you start paying close attention. During the legislative debate, you start drafting your spending plan based on what they're talking about. Once a bill passes, you're in the distribution phase, verifying everything on official government sites. Once you get the money, you receipt and maximize by putting your plan into action. And then, and this is key, post-stimulus, you don't stop. You use that breathing room to keep building resilience, because these economic cycles, well, they always come back around.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the end game, becoming a stimulus champion. This isn't about just winning once. It's about adopting a mindset that lets you navigate these situations successfully every single time, and maybe even help others do it too. This winning mindset really has 4 parts. It starts with being proactive, not reactive. It grows when you're strategic, thinking a few moves ahead. But what really makes a champion is being community-focused. When you share good, verified info with your friends and family, when you shut down misinformation you see online, you're making your whole community stronger. When you become that trusted source of info, that leader, you're not just helping yourself play the game better, you're helping everyone win. And really, in the end, it all comes down to this single idea. The exact same payment can be a temporary band-aid for one person, or it can be a stepping stone to real financial stability for another. The difference isn't luck, it's strategy, it's preparation, and it's choice. By playing the game smart, you can make sure that for you, it's always a tool for lasting improvement. Let's talk about stimulus checks. They're probably one of the most powerful and, yeah, one of the most controversial tools a government has in its toolkit. When a crisis hits, all of a sudden we're talking about billions, sometimes trillions of dollars meant to save the economy. But does it actually work? Today, we're going to dig into the data and get to the honest truth.
And that really brings us to the core question of this whole thing. Are these checks a desperate lifeline for families who are just trying to keep their heads above water? A necessary shot in the arm for the economy? Or are they a huge liability, a short-term fix that ends up causing bigger problems down the road, like debt and inflation? It's a massive question, and the answer, well, it's definitely not simple. So you've really got 2 camps here. On one side, people are saying these checks are absolutely essential. They stop the economy from collapsing and prevent widespread suffering. On the other side, you've got critics saying they're just reckless handouts that make problems like inflation way worse. The thing is, both sides have a point. So let's unpack the data and see what it tells us. First, let's look at the case for stimulus. Because, when these programs are done right, they can be incredibly effective. So what does getting it right actually look like? The first thing, and maybe the most important factor of all, is speed. In an economic emergency, you got to think of it like being a first responder. The help has to get there right now, not weeks or months later when all the damage is already done. Getting that money into people's hands fast is absolutely critical. Just look at the CARES Act back in 2020.
The law was signed on March 27th, and just 2 weeks later, only 14 days, money was already hitting people's bank accounts. For the government, that is lightning fast. And the effect was almost immediate. By May, you could see consumer spending pull out of a complete nosedive. That speed almost certainly prevented a much, much deeper economic collapse. Okay, so speed is one huge piece of the puzzle, but who gets the money? That is just as important. What we call targeting efficiency is all about making sure the stimulus goes to the people who are most likely to turn around and spend it immediately. That's what creates a real ripple effect through the economy. And this is where you can actually see that ripple effect in the data. Look at this. Households that had less than $500 in the bank, they spent almost half of their stimulus check within just 10 days. Now compare that to households with over $3,000 in savings. They spent basically nothing. It just goes to show you the exact same dollar has a radically different impact depending on whose pocket it ends up in.
All right, the next piece is scale. A stimulus can be fast, it can be well targeted, but if it's just too small, it's like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. Let's compare what happened in 2008 to what happened in 2020. The 2008 checks were smaller, and the total package was only $96 billion. The general feeling now was that it just wasn't big enough for the size of the crisis. Fast forward to 2020, the CARES Act was almost 3 times that size, which was much closer to what the economy actually needed.
And finally, you have to remember that stimulus checks don't work in a vacuum. The 2020 response wasn't just about sending out cash. It was a full-on, multi-pronged attack on the crisis. You had enhanced unemployment, you had support for businesses with the PPP loans, protections against eviction. All of these things were working together. A crisis hits families from every direction, so the solution has to, too.
But that, of course, is only half the story. These programs have some very real downsides, and it is crucial that we understand why they sometimes fail.
So, just like good timing is a key to success, bad timing can be a fatal flaw. But it's not just about being slow, it's about when the stimulus actually shows up in relation to what the economy is doing. If it arrives too late in the game, it can be almost useless.
And the 2008 stimulus is really the classic example of this. The checks went out in the early summer of that year. But the absolute worst part of the crisis, the Lehman Brothers collapse, the whole market meltdown, that didn't happen until September and October. So by the time the economy was in total freefall, the impact from those stimulus checks had already vanished. The timing was just completely wrong.
The flip side of getting money to the right people is, of course, getting it to the wrong people. When stimulus money goes to folks who don't really need it or aren't going to spend it, that economic impact is just massively reduced. That money is way more likely to just get saved or maybe used to pay down some debt, which doesn't really do much to stimulate immediate economic activity.
And, the data from the pandemic really backs this up. High-income households, they saved a whopping 40% of their stimulus payments. That is a huge amount of money that was just put on the sidelines instead of being put back into the economy. It's stimulus money that isn't really stimulating much of anything.
Another major reason these things can fail is the system itself. If a program is just too complicated, if it's hard to get to or difficult to even understand, it's pretty much guaranteed to fail the most vulnerable people. The very people it was designed to help in the first place.
And this is where policy slams right into reality. Despite all the good intentions, an estimated 8 to 12 million eligible Americans never even got their first stimulus check. And the reasons why are pretty simple and pretty painful. No internet, language barriers, or just not having a bank account. It's a tough reminder that a program is only as good as its ability to actually reach the people who need it.
And then, of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room, inflation. The U.S. government spent around $5 trillion on pandemic relief. That is just an unprecedented amount of money. And while the debate is really complex, a lot of economists argue that pumping that much cash into the economy was basically like pouring gasoline on the inflationary fire that we all felt at the grocery store and the gas pump. So we've seen the clear wins and we've seen the clear failures. But the reality is most stimulus policy lives somewhere in a messy gray area. It's not really about right and wrong. It's about navigating a series of incredibly difficult trade-offs.
So let me just ask you this, right? What's the better choice? Getting money out the door as fast as humanly possible, even though you know some of it's going to be messy, it might go to the wrong people or even fraudsters? Or do you take the time to build a slow, perfect system that gets every single dollar to the right person, but might show up way too late? There is no easy answer to that. And these are the core dilemmas.
This is what policymakers are constantly forced to choose between. Do you want speed or do you want accuracy? Do you want to reach absolutely everyone or only those who need it most? Do you provide generous relief right now or do you protect the country's long-term finances? Every single one of those choices means sacrificing something else.
But here's the thing. When policymakers manage to navigate these trade-offs correctly, the payoff can be huge. Studies show that for every $1 that gets into a low-income household, it actually generates about $1.50 in economic activity. That's that economic multiplier effect right there, a really powerful return on investment. And beyond the pure economics of it, there's a profound human impact here. The 2020 stimulus checks, for all their flaws, are credited with cutting the overall poverty rate by 10% in a single year. That's a staggering achievement. It literally kept millions of families, especially families with kids, from falling into poverty during a historic crisis. So, with all of this in mind, how do we get it right the next time? Because let's be honest, there will be a next time. Here's what the lessons from the past can teach us about designing smarter stimulus programs for the future. The path forward is really about being prepared. First, we need to create automatic triggers so help goes out the second a recession hits, without all the political delays. Second, we have to invest in the basic government plumbing, the infrastructure to get money out quickly and accurately. Third, we have to design these programs from day one to balance speed with accuracy. Fourth, the approach has to be comprehensive, tackling jobs, housing, and individual support all at once. And finally, every emergency plan needs an exit strategy to make sure we're not damaging our long-term financial health. Because ultimately, this isn't just about spreadsheets and economic models. It's about our shared responsibility when things get tough. It's about preventing suffering. You know, the hard-earned lessons from the past have shown us what's possible, and they've shown us what can go wrong. The real question for the future isn't if we'll face another crisis, but if we'll be wise enough to build a better bridge before we actually need it. You know, there's a question that just keeps popping up, and I see it everywhere. Are we going to get a fourth stimulus check? It's a huge topic online, and honestly, for very good reason. So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and really look at what the economy itself is telling us. So let's just get right to it. This is the question on everybody's mind. And listen, while there's tons of speculation out there, the real answer isn't buried in some political headline. Nope. It's found in the economic data. And that's not an exaggeration. We're talking about this today because for millions of people who are really feeling the financial squeeze, this isn't just some abstract idea. It's a very real daily concern. So let's try to get some real clarity. All right, here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with what actually triggers these payments. Then we'll look at a pretty surprising pattern from the past. After that, we'll zero in on the one economic number you need to keep an eye on. And finally, we'll talk about why the next stimulus might look totally different from the last one. Okay, first things first. What actually causes a stimulus check to happen in the first place? It's not random, and it's not just politics. It is a direct, calculated response to one specific event, an economy that's gotten sick. And when we say the economy is sick, we're really talking about a recession. That's the official word for it, right? A major, widespread, and kind of prolonged downturn that hits everything and everyone, from big corporations to your local coffee shop. And this right here is the core idea we need to understand. If you just look back at the last couple of decades, the pattern is crystal clear. Every single major recession has been followed by stimulus checks. Every single time. It's basically become a standard move in the modern economic playbook. Here's a great way to think about it. Imagine the economy is a patient. A recession? That's when the patient gets seriously ill. The lawmakers are the doctors, and their go-to prescription is a big old injection of cash. That's the stimulus, to try and get the patient back up and running. And it makes sense, right? The sicker the patient, the bigger the dose of medicine they're going to need. So let's dig into that history a little bit, because when you actually examine the numbers from past recessions, well, a really fascinating and maybe even predictive pattern starts to show up. Okay, check this out. Back in 2001, after the dot-com bubble burst, the check was for $300. Then in 2008, during that massive financial crisis, it doubled to $600. And then in 2020, with the pandemic, it doubled again to $1,200. Are you seeing the pattern here? Now, if you just follow that doubling logic, the next number in that sequence would be around $2,400. But, and I have to be super clear about this is just an observation of a historical trend. It is absolutely not a guarantee. The actual amount of any future check would depend completely on how severe the economic downturn is at the time.
So if a sick economy is the trigger, how do we know when it's sick enough for the doctors to step in? Well, there's one key health report that we can all look at. It comes out on the first Friday of every single month, and it's simply called the Jobs Report.
And inside this report, there are a few vital signs. You've got the headline number, the unemployment rate. But just as important is jobs created or lost. Are companies hiring, or are they laying people off? The labor participation rate tells us how many people are even trying to find a job. And average hourly earnings shows if our paychecks are keeping pace with inflation. Altogether, they paint a pretty clear picture of our economic health. So when you start to see that businesses, from the giant corporations all the way down to your local pizzeria, are slowing down their hiring, or worse, starting to let people go, that is a massive warning flare for the whole economy. It means people aren't spending as much, companies are getting nervous, and the whole economic engine is starting to sputter. That is the signal that gets lawmakers to scramble and start seriously talking about what they need to do. But, and this is really important, if they do act again, there's a good chance it won't be a carbon copy of last time. The whole strategy could shift to something much more targeted.
See, the last few checks were broad. They went out to a massive chunk of the population. A targeted strategy is different. It would focus laser-like on low-income and fixed-income households. Why? Because those are the folks most likely to spend the money immediately and pump it right back into the economy. This gives you way more bang for your buck, and it does it with less risk of driving up inflation for everybody else.
So the big takeaway here is this. We might need to adjust our expectations. If and when another stimulus package comes along, it could be designed very, very differently, maybe aimed at a smaller group of people to get the maximum economic impact with the fewest negative side effects.
Okay, so let's just trace that path one more time. It starts with an economic contraction. We see it in those bad jobs reports. That triggers the lawmakers' scramble, where they have to respond. Then a stimulus package is passed, and finally, the payments are distributed with one single goal: to get spent right away and kickstart the economy.
So that brings us to the final thought. Based on modern history, it really doesn't seem to be a matter of if the government will intervene in the next major recession. The real question is, how sick does the economy have to get before they open up that playbook once again? That's what we'll all be watching. You ever check your bank account and see a surprise deposit from the US Treasury and just think, where in the world did that come from? You know, a stimulus check can feel like it just materializes out of thin air. But the journey it takes from being a far-off idea to actually landing in your wallet, well, that's one of the most complex, high-stakes dramas in all of Washington. It's this wild path that twists through economic theory, bare-knuckle political fights, and some absolutely incredible logistical challenges. So let's pull back the curtain and really follow the money from the first whisper of a crisis to the very moment it hits your account. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We're going to trace this whole journey through 5 key stages. First, we'll look at what kind of emergency actually sparks the idea in the first place. Then, we'll meet the major players whose decisions really matter. After that, we'll dive into the treacherous legislative process a bill has to survive. We'll see how that law becomes actual cash. And finally, we'll look ahead and explore what the future of this kind of economic relief might hold. So, first things first, stimulus checks don't just get handed out on a whim. Think of them less like a, hey, here's a good idea, and more like an emergency tool. They're like the financial fire extinguisher the government only smashes the glass for when the whole economic house is on fire. These things are born from moments of serious national distress, when the normal flow of the economy is so broken that a direct, pretty drastic intervention is seen as maybe the only option left. Okay, so what does that distress actually look like? What are the specific signals Washington needs to see before the gears even start to turn on something like a stimulus plan? I can tell you, it takes a lot more than just a few bad headlines or a dip in the stock